Mukabate yawa wan duma gosa ke tindina gosa ke mumike wala gira duma afan sokotati wala sitter gaman duma rote oromo duma afan sokotati oromo duma tokicha gori oromo tokko yawa ummata kenya amirga ubiti loran diyamir dindir ke biratani akan tebe wali kabamu hanjali yawa bala afan chuba yasani jaranuba ummata kenya hunduma sabila champion so ummati kenya kara iti bangade kara tugade aldo hunduma ati kara kali si kara si male kara umara demu digenda ati kara iti agasti ummati kenya erga talake abbaga imati Hanyega Hanyeki, Ewu Kamna, Ewu Bilima Kamna, Yawa, ati Tijabalam Tumare, Uminama, Gatinka Bukova Isai, Kana Yawa, ati Tijabalam Miki, Bilima Kenya Mukaru, Bilisa Mubarak, Umata Kenya Mukati, Sukuma Kenya, Umuruzi, Kanajek Sinapika, Hamachak Sabine, Yawa, anti migranti, nukecho kibiratu, si kanuko kukajencha Kenya, nukajenchi, si kadanya kaya migrana bin, amal nanjela, ada yang dikir, wan inu cita dalam anggaran Kenya mereka, anak-anak yang berpikir ini semua ada lagi, amal tahu. Amin. Waktu itu kita pernah bila akan pentingnya itu karena ada yang penting cuba pada hanya menjadi bisa amal bukan awalnya aku tanya amal tiga negara kerja sekolah tanya ini sahabat keuangan alisa orang tiga negara kawal mana ibu bikinnya sahabat kata misal ini pun mengkalis ia kisah kita kurang mungkin kamu sekarang negara untuk bukan nurra kan jiru na sabigenya injam makin kan jiru baye ke kan mon pan wari te da wasu waye milga ma o waye e ma o ko da wasu ani am sana da nam tokke ba pariya bacche ke sa nam tokke ba pariya ne da chi aman chi rumah akan tadi dua dia boleh dapat koyo waktu berjadi berkali pun kira-kira dapat agak kita kapitan nu itu malah kan dia berikut juga kalau itu tidak rumah pun nama pokok akhirnya sahaja tidak masuk akal jadi itu bos awal pada waktu waktu seperti muawasu waktu bukan bukan Yesus waktu bukan bukan hukum waktu orang jalan orang waktu orang jalan orang waktu ayat Yesus waktu orang jalan orang jalan orang toko ya ada toko Allah semua kalau tak Yesus Kristus semua orang yang amin.
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Rumah dalam kan ini surah naik boleh semua dan kabar Rabbi manusia rumah kita bisa kare untuk bisa berpikir kare jadi mana untuk bisa kami kumakanan masih bisa posani wambe bisa shoulder mau dewa ini masa ini kucing apa kayaknya kucing biar punyati wanda mau politik apa wanda lain itu buat itulah kami karena puni في حبوبي ربي أملي وانبر الجرا والشنو هاتاسو بيا كينيا في مسألة كابتن كنا نعمل مكان كنا نقدر نقول بهاتو والجاي كينيا هاتنا والجاي من كها والجاي جاري والجاي نجار كاتو وانبر الماهو ربي أجلسوا بيا كينيا ريما مسلمان كينيا له ربي مكانو kita tadi di taman nura kan Rabu nura karu dan kita membahasnya dan anak Rabu juga sama pun dalam melalui saling kita operasi magaba kanilma anak pura bungkulu sadawa upame duran buse jawa kayu apa kenya baka jirura oromo to kunasiste kara oromo state association Wamin cenur ben akanan akawali bukan nugo tegalan di sifat tau wali ne wali nasofne wali marianne jecha to wali dabarsine lampe to wal jallanne akadem yawa kayu hukuma ke nurawul shibush jara wangari nu yadan undumanu tikabe yawa kayu jara ama nuratti yadan ummata ke kana rattama yadan nurra hanchi kabe gachana nutai ummata ti yallatte ummata ti ebiste akka coqorsaa kallate kan baay'ate yaa waaqayyo karaan irra deemaa jiru karaa bilisummaa atittiin uumteen karaa wal kabajuu atittiin uumteen karaa mirgati kenniteefiin yaa waaqayyo lafa yaade akka inni ga'u gidduutti akka saba Israa'el gaafa Misrii ba'utti burjaaja'ee karaa irratti hafee utuu hin ta'in tokko ta'ee tokkummaa isaa cimsatee kallattii keewwateen deemee lafa yaade akka ga'u yaa waaqayyo uummata keenya gargaara yoo badii balleessine yoo si yakkinellee atumti dhiifama kabbummaa keetti nu godhi malee dabarsitee alagaatti nu kennin jaalala kee uummata rakkoo keessa jiru hidhaa keessa jiru ajjechaa keessa jiru nu ilaali yaa waaqayyo jara lubbuu isaanii immoo uummata isaaniitiif kennuudhaaf ofitti murteeffatanii biyya isaanii uummata isaanii eegaa jiran irree isaanii nu cimsi ala waraanaa gaachana ta'eef injifannoof ta'eef uummata keenya ayyoota keenya yeroo akkana yeroo isaanii kennanii walitti dhufanii mari'atan waan jirri mari'atan kana kan biyyaaf ta'u kan uummataaf ta'u kan addunyaa kanaaf ta'u nu taasise yaa waaqayyo nu gargaara si qabnaa si malee waan qabnu yaa waaqi jennee bulla yaa waaqayyo ati nu gatin yaa waaqayyo ati nu dhiisin rakkoon keenya yoo baay'atellee lafa yaanne suma qabannee hin madeemna yaa waaqayyo maa rakkoo dhufe hin jennu rakkoo keenya irra immoo ittiin humna ceenu nu kenni nu ceesisi yaa waaqayyo hidhamtoota keenya nu hiiksisi jara lubbuun isaanii wareegame mootummaa keenya nu dhaalsisi daa'imman keenya nu guddisi hayyoonni keenya isa eebbisan yaa waaqayyo nurra bulshi milkoofnee akka walitti dhufnee jalqabne milkoofnee akka fixnu waan fixne immoo jirra oolshinee biyya keenyaaf uummata keenyaaf akka taanu yaa waaqayyo nu gargaari galanni siif haa ta'u.
Ayun bertumbuh yang berbeda. Profesor Kasam dan itu tu dari menekan pandai. Schedule ini di Jalan DBP program lemang terjadi. Aman tegak mesti pandai program terjadi. Dan aman berada di negara boleh. I would like to welcome you all because of shortage of time we're already running time. We can skip a few days. Move on to the next panel and then make it up at the end what we released from the schedule right now. So we have a lot of people. I have two schedules today. So this our board chair, Professor, the next panel, please be ready.
Thank you, Mr. President. I will take 2 minutes. Dear OSA members and attendees, welcome to OSA's 6th annual conference. The last time we met face-to-face was in 2018 at Catholic University here in Washington, D.C. Some of us met each other at our 3rd annual conference at Victoria University in 2019. In Finland, we met our people who came and greeted us from every region of Oromia, and we witnessed the love they have for us. From Jimma, Yole Sanimoti, we're joined by Yole Babora, and then by Yole Boriso. From Wallaga, Yole Tulu, ijoollee bakka deemuudhaan ijoollee abishee garbaa yoo ijoollee arabu keessaa inambo from halaan ijoollee arfan qalloo and from baalee ijoollee waa kubuutu ijoollee shakkamando from salaalee ijoollee taaddisee duruu and from walloo ijoollee mahamad alii abadee bashir from booranaa ijoollee abbaa dhiban dabbasaa guyyoo and joined Kenya and then joined Nure Badasu, Jole Nure Badasu. All conveyed on Mufinde, and for the first time met OSA at Oromo at Lafo, located a few kilometers away from Ganutu. Thank you, Oromo, for the love you have for OSA and for one another. God willing, inshallah, we will meet again. But by going to Mufinde, we tested the water to possibly chart our future, and the future of OSA. Today, that future is bleak. The water we tested got deeper and deeper, drowning tens of thousands of Oromo people, our people. When we come together today, after 3 or 4 years of separation, we do not only celebrate our reunion, but also get a moment of reflection to remember our compatriots back home who have been going through excruciatingly most painful life in the history of the Oromo people. We keep remembering the dead and the alive in our prayers. God willing, inshallah, thou shalt pass. For all OSA scholars, thanks for your continued dedication to Oromo studies and for your unrelenting efforts to move OSA forward with your knowledge and put our people and Oromia on the map of scholarship globally. I have only 1 minute. For OSA scholars back home, thank you for your participation and continued engagement under the most difficult circumstances. We hope the time to reunite will come soon for us to work as one body and for community of Oromo scholars. I thank everybody for telling me to stop. I thank everybody who is here, all scholars, OSA members. We are here because of you. You made us stronger than ever by every day. Particularly, I thank the conference organizing committee for making this conference a success. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you, David. Right, so our next and first panel is on theoretical approaches to self-determination. We have 4 presenters. Those of you who are here, Oboyari Sepasa and Dr. Mayuru can perhaps on the stage. And we have 2 panelists joining from Zoom. The first one is Dr. Asaba Ragasa. He's currently a senior research and teaching fellow at the University of Switzerland, PhD at the University of Bern, Germany, in the Field of Development Studies. Started as Associate Professor of Development Studies in Villa University and training, and get research interests in areas including terrorism, peace, and conflict studies, society relations, indigenous people rights, and extractive industry. Also published over 20 articles in peer-reviewed journals and 2 chapters, some of which recent publications were available and making progress. He authored this special manner. He also authored use of extraction and contestation, exploitation, execution, local resistance against micro academy. And he's currently serving as OSA president-elect, and he will be president of the conference. The title of his presentation is Self-Determination as a Decolonial Approach. Dr. Asaba, if you can hear me, you will be next. And then I'll introduce the remaining panelists. Those of you who are here, if you can come up to the stage, please. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Germa, for the introduction. Can you hear me, please? Would you give me a confirmation?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Okay, thank you, Germa, for the introduction, and thank you all for attending. Unfortunately, because of a visa application problem, I couldn't make it in person. It would have been really great opportunity to meet you in person in DC, but hopefully I will make it next round, next year. So as Girma already introduced, I'm giving this very brief presentation. I will try to make it in 15 minutes as indicated, self-determination as a decolonial approach. This is the fundamental core theme of the conference, as you also saw in the program. It is about the self-determination, and I will be making up, framing my presentation within a colonial and decolonial approach in a global context, and linking that into the Ethiopian particular historical phenomena. As you all know, Ethiopia as a colonial state had its own similarities with colonial systems across the world. And then I will connect that into the Oromo struggles for self-determination. My presentation will follow up this one. As I mentioned, as the entry point, I want to make two fundamental points. The first one is, when we talk about self-determination, although it is in most cases framed from a political and a legal frameworks, but I want to emphasize that it is a response to colonial systems, different dimensions of colonial systems, with its characteristics of political, epistemic, cultural, socio-economic dominations, and also the asymmetrical power relations that colonial system produces. So when we talk about self-determination, it is not only a democratic exercise, but it is a response to such histories of domination and marginalization. So in order to understand the quest for self-determination of different nations and nationalities, different groups, a decolonial approach is very important, because this approach unsettles or deconstructs the hegemonic narratives and the discourses on which colonial systems are built, and on which they were also try to legitimize their institutions. For example, colonialism or state building in general has been built through this modernizing or modernist civilizing missions. So this decolonial approach helps us to deconstruct these narratives. That is why I use the decolonial approach. I mentioned about the nexus between colonialism and self-determination. That is how we need to understand, because different international organizations, human rights associations, and so on, try to superficially touch about self-determination only from a democratic point of view, about human rights point of view, although it is about human rights and democratization, but it should go deep into the history about colonialism, about state building, about state formation, and so on, globally. And then we also link that into the Ethiopian context. So when we talk about colonialism, whether it is internal colonialism or external imposed colonial systems, then this colonialism in general strips people of their rights, their dignities, their knowledge. It expropriates their resources. People would be in general reduced to subhumans. Their dignity would be reduced. They begin to serve as laborers. They can't lead their own affairs by themselves. So that is one aspect of colonialism. But it is also beyond that. As we know, for example, in Ethiopia, through different state institutions across the successive regimes, selective historical narratives have been installed. And this is true across the colonial histories in the world also. Selective historical narratives means the history of the conquerors, the history of the colonial powers would be dominant. That would be represented either through symbolic representations or through material and discourses. And that becomes that helps the dominant groups or the colonial powers to produce regimes of truth. By regimes of truth, I mean it makes people to be legible to be governed by those rulers. And you can associate this into our own context, how the regimes of truth are have been developed and then made people to be submissive, or tried to make people submissive to successive regimes in Ethiopia. And the current, for example, the narrative of prosperity in Ethiopia under the Abiy regime could also be one regime of truth, which is in the process of being built to make people legible for that narrative. And on the contrary, such dominant narratives also silence counter histories. The history of the subject, the colonial subject, the history of those who were conquered becomes either marginal in the history books or silenced generally or erased. It is not about the history that I'm talking, but their rights, their glories would be silenced, erased. And then their entitlement to their land, for example, would also be given a different meaning, and the history of the dominant would be magnified. So when we talk about the self-determination, then it is against such historical phenomena of colonization, against these historical periods of domination, marginalization, expropriation of resources that beginning from around 18th century, one would even go beyond that, but from 18th century onwards, different movements in different parts of the world started. One might start with American War of Independence, the French Revolution, the post-First and the Second World War periods brought this idea of self-determination as a mobilizing forces for subaltern voices, or for those who were colonized, or for those who were dominated, so that their forms of knowledge, their institutions, their right to whatsoever we talk about, human right, democratic right, and others would be ensured through self-determination. So this is from the political perspective, but self-determination is also not only political, it also is discursive in a way, because when we talk about colonization, as I mentioned, it is not only political imposition of ruling, but it is also discursively instituted. Different discourses make people to be legible for governance, and then self-determination dismantles this narrative. And the third aspect of the decolonial turn, when we see self-determination through the decolonial idea, it is also emancipatory process, because when people gain the political right to self-determination, and when they also work hand in hand with the discursive aspects, when they dismantle those dominant narratives, then it leads to their emancipation of the mind, their knowledge, the way knowledge production is taking place, emancipation of their political system of domination, emancipation of their exploitation, or they would be emancipated from all sorts burdens of colonialism in general. So that is why we just bring this definition, although self-determination might have different dimensions, but generally it is a right of a collectivity to determine its future, be it political, economic, cultural, or a combination of these. I mean, when we talk about self-determination, it is a collective who determines about its future in terms of political, cultural, economic, and other aspects of life, whether to form a political statehood, or to have its own political institution within where it lives. And it had different aspects of implementation, either through statehood or through multinational federalism or through democratization within existing states whatsoever. This is the general aspects of self-determination in general. But self-determination is not only also a political aspect, but it had, particularly when we talk about the decolonizing aspect of it, it has policy implications or policy dimensions. And I brought only about 6 different areas in which people who struggle for self-determination could focus in order to achieve the right to self-determination, but within this fundamental notion of decolonization. The first one is education. Education is either a technology of emancipation or in another way, a technology of colonization and subjugation. The way curriculum is designed, the way education is given, the way people, the way people learn, this all make decolonizing the curriculum, for example, is one area in which one can engage. Economy is, as I mentioned, ensuring people's resource sovereignty. Under what circumstance, in what way could be different, detailed discussion could be there, but decolonizing the economy and it is extractivist institutions could be another area. The political is, I already mentioned, the political sovereignty or autonomy. And the issues of culture could also be, because I mentioned it is liberation, emancipation, and when people are culturally emancipated, then their identity would also be emancipated. The other aspect in which authoritarian states or colonial states in general also maintain their exercise their authority over people is through different material special symbolic representations like status, and so on. So reversing and dismantling these symbolic representations could also be another area. But very fundamentally is a knowledge area of knowledge production. Decolonizing knowledge production system is another area in which one would contribute through decolonizing methodologies, the way we do research, which also has actually been doing for the last 40 years. So let me bring you to Ethiopian context. I don't want to give much explanation about the Ethiopian context. You know the way the state was formed and what it has been doing against different nations and nationalities. And in the 1960s, that produced that oppressive system, that marginalization, exploitation, dispossession of people from their resources produced the struggle for self-determination, which I would also call a decolonization of the empire itself. The 1960s Ethiopian student movements, and then where different Oromo intellectuals and the students also contributed, it delegitimized the Ethiopian states. For example, with those questions like Obo Ibsa Gutama's poem where he said, "Who is an Ethiopian?" That kind of unsettled and disrupted that hegemonic narrative about Ethiopia. The issues of land to the tillers and then the peasant uprisings in different parts of the country, and in Oromia particularly also the Majat Ulama Association, and then the education revolution there, and particularly the birth of the OLF and the fundamental tenets of self-determination, which many young generations actually took over that commitment. And then through different processes, I mean, I don't want to go to each and every point, but after the post-1991 multinational federal arrangement, in which the OLF also contributed a lot during the transition period, then gradually the birth of the Kube generation, which is also a decolonizing the education system, which I mentioned before. The Kube generation was born through the decolonization of the education system, because children who start to learn in their vernacular language start to develop the identity, and that led to this recent Oromo movement and the protest, which we all know. And some few examples could be given in my context. The master plan, the protest against the master plan, and for example, the protest against Lagadambi gold mining I would say these were questions for resource sovereignty. And in general, these were a counter movements against the hegemonic state building project in Ethiopia. And I want to kind of conclude, because of the time, that I want to make 2 points. The first one is the struggle for self-determination in general, globally and even in our context, faces different resistance because it threatens the economic and the political interest of dominant groups. That is why we currently face different challenges and resistance from the state, from other actors, even including international organizations and international actors, because their interests would be threatened when people get their rights. And more importantly, what we need to know is in the post-2018, there is a return to this imperial vision in Ethiopia, and that is a major threat to the struggle to self-determination and to some achievements that the Ethiopian youth brought during those movements. And therefore, what I want to mention is we need to not only focus on the political dimension, but also on a multi-dimensional aspect of self-determination, including its narratives, discursive approach, and so on. And any effort against this that enhances consolidation of the Ethiopian state is against the struggle for self-determination. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Rafael. I really appreciate the time. Next, I'm going to introduce Madeleine Bass. I had the privilege last year for Madeleine's roundtable, which was on institutionalizing anti-colonial development of archive. So I'm going to introduce Madeleine again. And she is an early stage researcher completing her PhD with the MOOCs European Joint Doctorate. Dually enrolled at the University of Kent and the Free University of Berlin. In her current research, she works primarily with Oromo women, understanding the Oromo struggle in the technique of Black studies and critical indigenous studies. She lived in Western Oromia from 2014 to 2017. And the title of her presentation is Self-Determination as a Relation Alternative Approaches for Free Oromia. Madeleine,
can you all see my screen and hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. So thank you for that warm introduction. My name is Madeleine Bass. It's a pleasure to be with you all here digitally, even if I'm not physically there. And I really echo OSA ANNUAL and hope to be with you all in person someday. In today's presentation, titled Self-Determination as Relation, Alternative Approaches for a Free Oromia, I will think through notions of indigeneity and relationality, in order to understand ways of theorizing Oromo self-determination that move away from imperial violence. In this vein, I will begin by glossing over the idea of settler colonialism as a certain type of colonialism and the conditions this places on freedom and self-determination. I will then move into some critical indigenous theory to sketch out ways of understanding how indigenous relations may inform other approaches to self-determination. So I'm happy to be on a panel with Asebe also, because I think some of our ideas are kind of in conversation here, but I think this is where I take a bit of a turn. So I would say Ethiopia and settler colonialism is different than internal or external types of colonization, because the process of settlement led to the creation of a settler colonial nation state, and the colonizers never left. In order to uphold their settlement, these forces used complex projects of bordering and ordering, forced assimilation, bureaucracy, and open violence. Some of the traits and some scholarship around settler colonialism and its nuances are listed on the slide here, but perhaps the easiest example to identify of another settler colony is the United States or Canada. Indigenous peoples were colonized and remained captured by a violent genocidal state that refuses full respect for their existence. I talked to you all in Washington, D.C., just as the Ethiopian state hosts its events in Addis Ababa, shadowing the living legacies of Finfinne. Settlement and illegitimacy of the settler state put immediate pressure on forms of sovereignty and potential self-determinations that exceed the state. I think this relationship is summed up well here by Mohawk scholar Audra Simpson, as she says, the state seeks to destroy what is not. It does so with a death drive to eliminate, contain, hide, and in other ways disappear what challenges its legitimacy. Indigenous political orders. And here's the rub. Indigenous political orders are quite simply first, are prior to the project of founding, of settling, and as such continue to point in their persistence and vigor to the failure of the settler project to eliminate them, even as they are subjects of dispossession, of removal. Their polities serve as an alternative forms of legitimacy and sovereignties to that of the settler state. So Simpson is writing here from another settler colony. I'm struck by the way this resonates with the Ethiopian experience. The borders and bordering of the Horn of Africa are a clear example of the legacy of settlement, one I always return back to. What kind of people or nation can truly be separated by a wall and a straight line? This map tells a story of imperial and settler colonial state making. The sovereignty that it normalizes does not make sense or make justice for Indigenous peoples. Rather than thinking of the way people actually relate to each other and the land, the language was shifted into ownership, citizenship, paperwork, and declarations of state property. I use this larger regional example to demonstrate that the sovereignty or self-determination prescribed and demanded by such nation states is one that is rooted in violence and the colonial impetus to collect and trap potential resources. As Indigenous activists in what is now known as Mexico say, we didn't cross the border crossed us. This legal establishment created a socio-political culture that normalizes the nation state. Thinking with abolitionists and anti-colonial scholars, however, I believe that theorizing self-determination with the assumption that the nation-state form is correct, appropriate, or inevitable is to begin by foreclosing a world of opportunity. The Oromo and other Indigenous peoples model a way of living and relating that upends and refutes the colonial world order. Indigenous political orders, as referenced by Simpson, describe indigeneity as a way of understanding people beyond the static legal definitions of the concept. Indigenous conveys a relationship. It is not a question of rights, but of responsibilities, as stated by scholars like Morton Robinson. To quote Tuck and Rowe, Indigenous understandings of land predate and have co-developed alongside and in spite of settler constructions of property. To clarify these meanings of indigeneity and to move this conversation back towards self-determination, I want to use the peoplehood model. So this model was proposed by Holm, Pearson, and Chavez as a way of theoretically linking Indigenous experiences across different regions. The model shows that Indigenous peoples are a part of, rather than an imposition on their environment. More specific to the conversation of self-determination, the peoplehood model is meant to help reconsider what a legitimate political form looks like beyond the narrow hierarchical state forms that have come to dominate. There are 4 concepts in the model, defined individually but deeply interconnected, as the graphic shows: language, sacred history, ceremonial cycle, and place or territory. They're kind of deceptively simple because these things also include language. For example, it's not just the expression of Afan Oromo, it's references and nuances, the significance of oral histories in telling the Oromo story, the melodies and call and response forms of songs, stretching across Oromo cultural communities and dialects, even for those Oromo people who've been denied access to their language. This links naturally to a sacred history, as we see how kinship structures are, for example, both labeled and lived, how something like Oromuma is so steeped in historical experiences. Ceremonial cycles are temporal, as we can think with Gara timekeeping, but they're also the connection between the how, the why, and when certain ceremonies take place, as with Arecha, a symbol of thanksgiving and what giving thanks to Oromo land looks like in that season. Place and territory, Oromia, the last piece of the puzzle, means both the physical space, but also Oromia as a sacred context and place where cultural memories and the songs of ancestors live. This distinction of place as a context and a site of memory is really key because it recognizes the relationships to land held by those Oromos who are displaced and exiled. This is something that's been described in some way by Kuekumsa as transnational indigeneity. Using peoplehood as a way to understand or make sense of sovereignty helps to form a starting point for the furtherance and expansion of Oromo self-determination. Rather than definitions that rely on violent colonial constructs like borders, peoplehood legitimizes the parts of a nation and people that are unconquered and unconquerable. Even if parts of Oromia, Oromuma, and the Oromo people are under attack, their sovereignty remains intact through the vitality and interconnections of their peoplehood. To make this abstraction more directly linked to Oromo epistemologies, we may look at the relationship between Ayana, Uma, and Safu, as described by Gemechu Magersa and other scholars. These three notions are not easily condensed or glossed over, and I would not want to disrespect all of the rich scholarship around them by attempting it. But in a simplistic way, repeating the language used by Gemechu Magersa in his 2005 article, we can see Ayana as a spirit existing before and after that which it causes to come into existence, both knowledge and the knowledge of that knowledge. Uma is the physical world, both living things and the divine beings contained within it. And Safu is the ethical basis of action and how these lives can be lived together. These three concepts express the relationships between materiality, humanity, history, future, and the intangible. Peoplehood is built around relationality, just as in the Oromo epistemology, the created universe is held together by these concepts and their connections. No item can be divorced from its spirit and the role it plays in the larger conditions of ethical rightness, wrongness, and cohesion. When relationships are disrupted, self-determination is also under attack. Expressed in the peoplehood model, for example, the Oromo language evokes ceremonial cycles and meanings that cannot be separated from the Oromo homelands, even if settlement has sought to erase these names and traditions. The challenge comes then in both clarifying these meanings and translating these existing sovereignties into descriptions that may be intelligible to larger international bodies and legal frameworks. I think it's interesting that both Oboasewe and I use this idea of intelligibility and trying to make these things translate or become clear in a framework that kind of fundamentally doesn't understand them or doesn't want to make room for them. To take a kind of final practical turn towards the tensions between self-determination as it's under attack and the resilient sovereignty of the Oromo peoplehood, I want to use a visual example. I hope this is clear. I kind of blew up the contrast a bit so you can see some of the shadowy things. But a few things stick out or come to mind here. The Heineken building, we can see on the left side with its bright red star. The African Union Tower is visible in the distance, kind of peering overhead. There's a river running through in the bottom corner with trash and other muck piled up on its shores. And there are houses whose rooftops peek up in between the lush green trees, in between opposing ends of extreme wealth and power and everyday lives on the margins. As an example of Oromo peoplehood under attack by the force of the settler colonial state, this image paints a somewhat grim picture. So Heineken's rapid rise and encroachment into local economies and foodways strengthens capitalism in the global north and the commodification of cultural practices. The pollution and trash comes from a city that doesn't have the infrastructure to support its citizens, threatening both the land it crosses and the networks and waterways it links to. And the African Union is a symbol of the international recognition of nation-state sovereignty and settlement over Oromo indigenous sovereignty, as has been described by Ayanta Tebeso. In contrast, as a hopeful future, or an Oromia where self-determination and peoplehood are strengthened, we still see something special on these water shores. The trees have found the vitality remaining in this water, its source of life, and they have responded despite the disruptions of pollution. This kind of resistance has been called eco-sovereignty, the inherent self-determination of land that is visible when you understand its relationality. The houses tucked along this river and the people who make their lives here have a knowledge of this land and water that supersedes the vision available to those elites on the top floor of the Heineken building who peer out and see only potential profit. I also point this out to show that peoplehood as a complex web of relations does not disappear even in the face of such overwhelming state violence. So given this, how does self-determination grow and become real and tangible? I would ask, rather than thinking that sovereignty and self-determination can only occur using pathways created by states and bodies that value settlement and remain steeped in the imperial, what else exists? Self-determination that fails to consider the foundational value of peoplehood does not do justice to the intricacies of Oromo Ayana, Uma, and Safu. I turn to an Oromo proverb, which is translated and has been discussed by Kue Kumsa. When the reeds are burned in the valley, the sieving basket weeps in the kitchen. A self-determination found with the reeds and the basket, the past and present versions of something interwoven within a larger set of relations, or a self-determination of fire, asserting a demand to exist over all others. Without getting too lost in these metaphors, I'd say sovereignty and self-determination through relation begin when we see the relationships to land and to each other beyond the language of ownership and possession. In this sense, a sovereign or self-determined state is not one that you have ownership over, an Oromia who is free simply because the hierarchy has been flipped and Oromo people are in leadership positions. Sovereignty is the freedom to live, love, feed your community, protect your youth and elders. Freedom in this sense requires healing, as Kue Kumsa says. Healing, I mean creating a home of justice and liberation. This is a freedom that disrupts and refuses hierarchy, and what's more important, restores the critical relationality, care, and solidarity that are working to resist the existing structures of injustice and unfreedom. If the first priority in the definition of self-determination is relationships, strengthening pieces of peoplehood and the people around, we may begin in a more practical sense to find a form of self-determination that moves towards a freedom that makes us, to riff off Saidiya Hartman, as free as we actually want to be.
For that, share my time from the so next, so regarding the Zoom presentations, we have two panels that are here in the room. I'm going to introduce Dr. Manuel. He is a long-standing member of OSA, former lecturer at Harvard University Department of Philosophy. He studied philosophy at the AAU bachelor's and at Leipzig University MA and PhD in Germany with specialization in political and moral philosophy. He also had an MBA from City University of Seattle. The title of his presentation is Citizenship versus Identity in the Current Political and Physical.
Hello, hello. So thank you, Mr. Chairman. It's an honor and for me to present the input of you about citizenship and identity politics.
I say citizenship versus identity politics, because in Ethiopia most of the time, issues are presented as black and white, as binary or opposite issues. So that is what I wanted to try to reflect on the topic. Why I should present on this issue is because there is a permanent political discourse within Ethiopian politics in categorizing two kinds of movements as if there are two diametrically opposites exclusive to one another. So they categorize. So in that case, categorization goes like this. Citizen politics is more of political, rational, universal, impartial, has nothing to do with identity. And identity politics is always primordial, something primitive, something that is related to nature than to human beings. So something that emotionally charged and very particularistic. That is how they characterize these two different approaches. So my question is whether such kind of categorization could be theoretically helpful, theoretically, tenable, and practically helpful in resolving the problem of the country. What I would say, I would like to examine whether this categorization could be falsified or could be affirmed. I would like to approach the issue from two perspectives. One is from practical perspective, that means from history, and the other is from theoretical perspective. And both in theory and practice, there have never been a single conception of citizenship. There has been always different conceptions, different understanding of what citizenship is, both in history and theory. We know for sure, liberals, social democrats, Republicans, for example, they do have different conceptions of citizenship. For liberals, it is the autonomy of the individual, what's the important, the liberty of the individual, what's the important to be recognized as citizen. For social democrats, the welfare. Welfare, that means equal distribution of resource is what guarantees citizenship. For Republicans, patriotism, common and collective sense of identity is very important. So in terms of theory as well, we can enumerate a number of other doctrines. They do have different conception of citizenship. But let me switch to the practical one is membership in any case, in all these liberal, social democrats or Republicans, it means inclusiveness. It means membership. Despite their difference, they do have such similarity. Common membership to a political community is what they call citizenship. The best example for this, I have to come to the historical incidents. For the first time in human history, the concept citizenship has been used by the Greeks. As far as the world literature is concerned, the Greek city-states, before the state we know today is formed. That means before the birth of Jesus Christ in 500 BC. They used to have city-states. In these city-states, they consider citizenship as membership to free male inhabitants of a city. But mind you, when we say free male, it shows already exclusivity. That means there are people who are not free. These are the slaves, the conquered people. were captives, were not free people. And it says also male. Male excludes the female already. So that means even that time, the adjective free, the adjective male immediately implies a citizen is therefore one who is not a slave or a female. He appreciates, the citizen appreciates the value of citizenship from a negative perspective. That means what is citizenship? Citizenship is a right that gives you not a right to be not a slave or not a woman. So that means we explain the virtue of citizenship in reference to what is not rather than to what it is. So we are not enumerating the rights of citizens, but we are explaining the privilege of a citizen in reference to slavery and female or gender inequality. It's not moving. No. What's going on? Okay. And no, let me okay. No. So the second form of citizenship understanding was during the Roman Empire. During the Roman Empire, as you know, there was stratifications of more stratification, diversification of social classes. Because of that, citizenship was not considered even as a political membership. It was considered as a kinship relation because citizens were inhabitants of the Rome city, Not all inhabitants in that case as well. Only the noble class, the nobility, the class, people who belong to the noble class and residing in the Roman Empire, in the Rome city, not in the Roman Empire as such. So that means, if you remember, this European way of naming a family, describe, three parts of a name was originated during the Roman Empire. And that is to indicate those who are born in such a privilege, in such a kinship relationship, then they were privileged. So in order to exclude others, the three Norman, it was called Norman, or a three-part name was adopted. That means it was not allowed for everybody to adopt such kind of three-part name. So in that case, again, it is an exclusion. Citizenship is an exclusion. It's based on exclusion, based on your identity in that case. It has never been universal. It has never been a privilege to everyone. So the prayer name nomina was an inclusive mark of Roman citizenship in order to protect and preserve the purity of that citizenship. This tradition has later descended to emerging feudal system, to the point the concept of citizenship be identified only with aristocratic class, reducing all others to mere subjects. So as we know, in the Dark Age or in the feudal system, in fact, there was no, the very concept of citizenship has been eradicated altogether. Because with the emergence of absolute monarchy, the very concept was eradicated since the purpose of states and politics became nothing but to fulfill the will of God in and through the emperor. So let me skip this one because of shortage of time. What I want to say here in the Ethiopian political orthodoxy is there was no such kind of citizenship in Ethiopia all throughout. Even those ruling, those who we know as ruling class or as the dominant elite, they were not even themselves citizens as such in the modern sense of understanding. But all of a sudden this time, the issue or the concept of citizenship has become very important in Ethiopia. My question is, why is that so? The concept has been unknown to Ethiopian political history in whatever form it may be. And the reason, so the reason why it became important is, by centering one concept as a central issue of politics, they tried or they attempted to overcome different aspects of political issue. They want to reduce it to a single issue, as we did during socialist time, to the issue of class. Now they are attempting to reduce it to the issue of citizenship. So, so the reason is the issue is therefore, in doing so, they presuppose the already existent dominance of a definite identity as a given mark of their conception of Ethiopian citizenship. So they are attempting to universalize a particularity. In the modern world, citizenship is understood as authorship, as agency. That is through the Enlightenment time, it is called modern age. Through that time, any rational human being, as long as a member of that political community, is considered to be a citizen, because by virtue of the fact that he is entitled or she is entitled to determine the form of government in which he or she lives. So it is a human agency, the human rationality, which has been recognized. With it, the sovereignty of the people. When we say sovereignty, it sounds usually just common word, but it is not. It simply says the people is the determinant. The people is the decisive force, not only in electing governments or not in putting procedures of government, but in instituting, founding the society itself. The very state formation is based on people's will. So the theory of contract theory has become very popular during the Enlightenment time. That means it is not, state formation is not a matter of God's will, or it's not a matter of nature. It is a matter of human understanding, human agreement, human contract, which creates a state formation or a state itself. So with that, democracy in nations started understanding themselves as voluntary association, as this has been articulated by this contract theorists. So citizenship is not just a set of rights for election, but essentially authorship to the very law that creates and governs the nation state, so that there will be no contradiction between authority and freedom. Because I form it as the people form the state, if the authority, there is no contradiction between the authority and my free will, because the government is instituted by me. So whenever I obey the authority, I'm obeying my own will. So there is no contradiction between authority and will. Okay, let me. So for me, self-determination at this time is a locus of citizenship. That means people's right to decide the form of government is one of self-determination. That means it is the will of the people that matters. And that's what, as I was sitting there and hearing my colleagues, I thought that 50 minutes is too long. Now it has become very short. Well, on this issue, because more and more, particularly since globalism has been engulfing the whole world, the issue of this diversity, pluralism has become more and more important. Because of this, there is now in political philosophy a very heated discussion on this issue. So there are three different schools, particularly liberalism, communitarianism, and communitarian pluralism. These are, I mean, living philosophers, living politicians, political theorists who are engaging with this issue. I wanted to present, in fact, just a small part of this theoretical debate, but I'm running out of time, so I have to skip again. So, in any case, I mean, the Abisha attempt, I mean, to diffuse the issue of citizenship, the issue of Oromo issue or pluralism to citizenship is just indifference to difference. Indifference to difference is not, however, so innocent. It is, so just me, indifference to indifference is not an innocent standpoint, it is rather an active cover-up in diffusing stripes of the dominated identity. It is ideological maneuver in maintaining the already established hierarchy of identities by reducing all other issues to individual liberty. So this is why they continue to portray that individual after their own image, namely, as speaking Amharic, dancing Skista, adhering to Coptic Church, adoring Minilik Satan, promoting the legendary tale of Sheba and Jewish descent of the Ethiopian dynasty. That is a very image of individual identity in Ethiopia. So it is just to promote this image why they became indifferent to difference. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Dr. Mayu, and sorry for rushing you. Next, I'm going to introduce Yared Pata. No relation with OSA, but Yared was one of the first Oromos I met in 1986. And he hasn't been yet, so thank you for that, just remembering that. And so, Yared comes from Brunei, my hometown. And his education is Bachelor in Political Science and International Relations from Astoria University. He's Jewish doctor from David Kraft School of Law, Washington, D.C. He told me that this was his school. And title of his presentation is Opportunities for and Challenges to the Formation of a State for an African Nation, for an ancient African nation. So,
First, it's an honor to be here. I don't speak up Oromo, but I'm as devoted as a son of a father can be. Okay, let me start with some theoretical things about self-determination. So the practice of self-determination started around 1527 when the French king proposed to solve the destiny of a contested area, Burgundy, where the Spanish king was claiming power over. So that was the first step. And then there is, as a doctrine, it began, or it was enunciated first during the French Revolution when the French authorities declared that France is not going to use conquest to take over free people or the freedom of others. Fast forward to 1891, Emperor Minilik wrote a separate letter to the European heads of state saying that if you come across from long distance to take over or to scramble over lands in Africa, I will not be an indifferent spectator. And he pushed a military expedition towards the south, and he has no idea what he was doing. It was just sheer power. And he conquered a lot of lands. there were people, there were kingdoms, and of course, confederacies of Oromos. So by the end, when the empire was created, there was no idea, there was no direction. It was just an empire without a purpose. It didn't have any founding narratives. There was no story, what it is, where it comes from, what to achieve, who was going to captain it, and who to serve. Of course, I'm sorry. So by the end, because there was no founding narratives, there was no idea, there was no ideological pursuit. The empire that he founded was solely defined territorially. Like the French, they used to have liberty, fraternity. You have freedom, life, freedom, and pursuit of happiness. So that territorially defined empire was just existing until some efforts were started, some efforts were made to create a nation out of the desperate peoples. And of course, they used forced assimilation, including the criminalization of the Oromo language. At some point during Haile Selassie, it was illegal. It was punishable by law to pray in Upper Oromo. Under Mengistu, they used Ethiopian first for sociality. Then during the PRF, they used federalism. These are all trying, attempts to create a nation out of different disparate peoples. So of course, there are some, culturalization and assimilation as a result of these efforts. But at the same time, these forced methods have created resistance. And as a result, Ethiopia remains as fractured as ever. And another concept is Ethiopia is not sacrosanct. Ethiopia can be intervened with or interfered with. Ethiopia can be changed. Ethiopia can be modified. This exaggerated exaltation of Ethiopia is standing in the way of changing Ethiopia for the better. Changing Ethiopia for the better means the peoples residing in it have a right to determine their political status. That is most Oromos, of course. So I was a proponent of federalism for a long time. And of course, self-determination has been floated around as an option to solve the Oromo problem, the Oromo question. But in recent years, in the last few years, there is a growing passion among Oromo activists and intellectuals for independence. So I wanted to know, what are the reasons? And I could come up with at least two reasons. One is a choice, because the Oromo nation is, at least the Oromo country is as big as Germany, territorially, and in terms of population size, our Oromo population is comparable to that of Ukraine. So it's a big people, it's a big nation. And then you have the better system, civilization of thousands of years of age, and it engenders strong passion and pride among the Oromos. So with this, the Oromo nation is too historical and too good for assimilation to be a desired goal. So assimilation is not a good way to go for Oromos. So there is another reason for people wanting statehood, and that is the endless repression, economic deprivation, and unequal treatment. So successive Ethiopian regimes have used what some intellectuals call mass categorical violence. They consider Oromo freedom fighters as dangerous enemy. I mean, of course, motivated and dangerous enemy. And especially in recent years, they have started, publicly adopting now strategy. One of the officials of the TP is quoted as saying, the Oromo freedom fish that swim in the sea of Oromian civilians, thus, must kill is a preferred tactic to drain the sea. Such an approach, such an attitude would perpetuate conflict, and there is a risk of genocide. So actually, some Oromos claim that there is genocide already. Genocide has taken place already. The second one is when Ethiopia be democratized. And for democracy, a lot of intellectuals say economic development is a precondition. But there is no sign of economic development in Ethiopia. And the little progress that we have seen or has been declared or has been attributed to the rule of EPRDF in the last 30 years, 27 years, it has generated inequalities. And that inequality coincides with ethnic identity. Oromos are the spectators of Ethiopia's growth. The second one is Oromos are grossly underrepresented in the federal administration. I myself, as a former employee of the Ethiopian government, there are two contradictory things going at the same time. One is the standard to be like an Amhara. I speak Amharic. I was loyal to Ethiopia. An opportunity as an Amhara. And this is the fate of all Oromos. All Oromos who have pride in themselves, those who claim that they're Oromos, they will face this discrimination. You cannot have an opportunity as the favorite Ethiopians, but you'll be expected to meet that standard like other Ethiopians. So opportunities. In November 2020, there was a war declared against Tigray. That war had a striking resemblance with the war that started in 1861 in the US. Striking similarity, but the outcomes are different. The outcomes are different. Here, Abraham Lincoln won the war, and the right of states to secession became unconstitutional. In Ethiopia, however, the Tigrayans have resisted, at least so far, have not been vanquished. So the constitution is still in effect. So Oromos have a legal right at this point to exercise their right to self-determination. Okay. Challenge among Oromo elites. There's a conundrum whether to solve the problem of Ethiopia or to address the Oromo question. Then there's a war declared on Oromos. Can Oromos be independent in a peaceful way? Is peaceful secession a possibility? Is it an oxymoron to expect non-violent separation? And then you have people like pundits and politicians inventing illegitimate fear for the anxiety of the common folk. They don't know what's going to come after Oromo independence. And conclusion, Oromos have been are denied a natural justice by means of inclusion into Ethiopia. So the question becomes, are Oromo willing to wait until Ethiopia has become humane and democratic and flexible to accept Oromo identity? This will take generations. Or are the Oromo people just doomed to be in a helpless situation in the face of mass violence, economic stagnation, unemployment, corruption, and the eventual possibility of inevitable decline of the ailing state? Or is this an opportunity for Oromo to renew their Gada civilization? Thank you.
Thank you so much everybody for listening, and thank you the panelists. At no fault of this panel, we ran out of time and we're supposed to move to the next panel, so there will not be Q&A, and I apologize for that. But again, it's no fault of the panel, it's all the panelists. But we started late, that's why. So we will move to the next panel. Thanks so much.
Again, thank you for the time. The next panel, Assistant Affairs Policy for Ethiopia, please. Then you can get the moderator online and our speakers to come here. Josh. Can you hear us? Sound check one.
Yes, I can hear you. Can you all hear me?
You guys will hear back.
Here.
Yes, I can hear you.
These are mine.
Good, good.
He's going to lay out how he's going to conduct this for us. I think. How are you comfortable? Are you able to see the panelists? You okay?
Yeah, so I am able to see the panelists, and I can also see Faisal online.
Okay.
Good.
Okay.
So shall Great. So I think I heard my cue to get started. So that's what I will do. Greetings, everyone. My name is Mike Wildemariam. I am a professor at Boston University And as you can all tell, the moderator for this policy roundtable titled Assessing the Impact of U.S. Horn Policy in Oromia, Ethiopia, and the Horn. And I'd like to thank upfront OSA for the kind invitation to moderate. I will certainly do my best to facilitate a discussion, productive exchange of views. And my sincere apologies for actually not being there in person. It was actually my intention to be there in person, but for a variety of reasons, I was unable to make it at the last minute. So as you've all probably anticipated, this is the focus of this session will indeed be on U.S. policy and engagement in Ethiopia. And I think we can all agree, this isn't news to anyone, that Ethiopia sits at a particularly complex and difficult. And I think that the current situation raises a really challenging policy conundrum for the United States, which has been a longstanding partner of Ethiopia and has been, I think, for better or worse, a particularly prominent stakeholder in the country's affairs. And so today's conversation, I think, is going to proceed in a pretty unscripted fashion, but I do hope we're able to touch on several key issues. And let me just identify them here. First, hopefully we're able to discuss the political context in which U.S. policymakers must engage. So what is the political state of play in Oromia, in Ethiopia more broadly, and indeed across the Horn of Africa? Second, I think it would be helpful if we were able to take some stock of U.S. policy as it's been conducted and implemented over the past couple of years, and sort of assess what the policy orientation has been, why, and what the policy successes and shortcomings past approaches have actually yielded. And third, I think it'd be useful to engage on this interesting question of the capacity of actually shape outcomes and events in Ethiopia. That is precisely what leverage do U.S. policymakers have in the current context, in Ethiopia. And then finally, hopefully we can talk a little bit about the future and what U.S. policymakers should or might do to sort of help Ethiopia and the Horn out of the current quagmire. So, as we engage on these issues and more, I think part of my hope is that this session can help foster a discussion of U.S. policy vis-a-vis Ethiopia that is inclusive of what is happening across the country, because, of course, what is happening in the North is serious, very important, has received a lot of very warranted policy attention, but the dynamics in the North, of course, cannot be separated from broader countrywide dynamics and what is developing in other regions, including the South. So we have a really excellent panel to help us work through balance between people that have a lot of expertise and local knowledge in the region, and those that also know U.S. policy well. So let me introduce our participants, our panelists. So we have with us Fatuma Badasso, who's an Oromo rights advocate based in Virginia. She has a BA in political science from Metro State University, an MA in human rights and rule of law from Regent University School of Law, and is currently pursuing her JD PhD. We also have with us Bakala Gerba, who is a retired professor in foreign languages at Addis Ababa University. He is, of course, active in politics, having campaigned for parliament with the Oromo Federalist Congress. He became a party deputy in 2015 and currently serves in that role. Again, as many of you will know, he pretty prominent political prisoner, having just been released in January of this year. This comes on the back of an earlier stint as a political detainee. Faisal Roble is a civil servant with the city of Los Angeles and a recognized authority on matters, all things of the Horn of Africa. He's written a book looking backward and looking forward, the Ogaden region in the 21st century. It's published in 2011. And he is the author of numerous articles. He currently serves as the director of research for the Institute for Horn African Studies and Affairs based in the United States. Susan Stigant is also with us. She's the Director of Africa Programs at USIP, the U.S. Institute of Peace, where she leads programming related to East Africa, the Greater Horn, the Red Sea Arena, and the African Union. Her thematic focus is on the design and implementation of inclusive constitutional reform and national dialogue processes. So I think issues quite germane to contemporary Ethiopian affairs. And then, of course, we have Josh Maservi with us, who's a research fellow for Africa at the Heritage Foundation. He studies African geopolitics, counterterrorism, refugee policy. I'll also say someone who's been quite engaged on Ethiopia-related topics of late. I think in a former life, he was a Peace Corps volunteer and worked with Church World Service based out of Nairobi, Kenya. So about the biographical details of our panelists, but that's who we have on stage to help us work through, I think, some pretty challenging and difficult questions. So in terms of how we are going to structure the conversation, we've come to an agreement with the panelists. What we're going to do is have three of our panelists in this order, Fatuma, Bekele, and Faisal, lead us off with some prepared remarks, about 7 to 10 minutes. And then I will moderate a Q&A that includes those three, and then also Susan and Josh. And we'll do this for about an hour, and then we will move to audience questions. And I am told, and colleagues in the audience can correct me if I'm wrong, but there's a laptop in the room where audience members can type in questions. Those questions will be relayed or transferred to me, and I will put them to the esteemed panel. And what I would ask of colleagues on the panel is please speak into or at the mic so I can hear you, so Faisal can hear you, and please speak somewhat slowly if you can. And I think this will be a productive session. So Fatuma, why don't I turn it over to you?
You guys hear me? You guys can hear me? Mike, can you hear me?
I can hear you, yes.
Okay. Thank you for that introduction. And thank you for those who organized this panel and invited me to be a part of this. I think is an extraordinary opportunity to speak on U.S. foreign policy and what went wrong, and as a cohort of the diasporic youth movement, and part of the wider Oromo youth movement back home, I would like to just pivot our attention to the mass grassroots Oromo youth movement that was sustained for approximately 4 years, and which led to the transition within a derailed transition. And where I think U.S. foreign policy to Ethiopia. As we all know, the Oromo Youth Movement, which was sparked by youth in Central Oromia, primarily protesting, the land that, if I may say so, Oromo farmers, which in an effort to expand Burundi or capital Addis Ababa about 20 times its size, but which overall encompass the long-standing historical grievances Oromos have had within the Ethiopian state or the Ethiopian empire, and how that movement, which was very disciplined, very organized, very strategic, and included all aspects of Oromo society and involved civil society, religious organizations, farmers, was very successful in its ambitions and very successful in its vision, and had a clear goal, had clear asks, which were within the framework of the existing constitution, and which was essentially ignored by the West, primarily the United States, and it being ignored is, I think, in my opinion, is one of the biggest mistakes that the United States made, and which is a big consequence of where we are at within the Ethiopian state and the Ethiopian political conundrums, as Mike just summarized. And so I would like to just, have my panelists here bring to their attention that, that youth movement was really not necessarily just within the Oromo ethnic group, but it, grew to really encompass the entirety of the country, because most of the nations and nationalities, which tend to be in the periphery of different politics and socioeconomic spaces, joined eventually, and which is why it forced the existing regime to really choose to reform within internally. And it was actually effectively sidelined when it came to, when it came to the decision-making and table, and or almost historically, as many of our previous panelists have shown, I don't know if you guys heard it, but have been pushed to the periphery politically, socially, economically, and so have not been able to inhabit the spaces in which these narratives, especially dominant narratives, have been set, where Oromos have been portrayed as destabilizers or existential threats to the Ethiopian state or existence of Ethiopia as a country, which is not the case, because for those who have followed the Oromo protests, which were sustained for 4 years, the asks were within the framework of the existing constitution, and the asks were very and directly democratic. And that the United States not engaging that youth movement and historically sidelining Oromo voices, whether it be advocacy groups or youth groups or political organizations or civil society, weren't being taken as seriously as what is, the Ethiopian, those who take the Ethiopian name to the table, and how that effectively has pushed the Oromo to the periphery still, and how doing that has really contributed to the current political quagmire and actually the possible disintegration of the country, because Oromos inhabit a central location geographically, have a large share of economic input into the Ethiopian state, and have a large population within the Ethiopian state. And Oromos have tried and continue to try to play a stabilizing role, not just within Ethiopia, but within the Horn of Africa. And a lot of what the United States policy initiatives have missed is, I think, at the core of that is this very fact. So I just wanted to, bring this to all of our attention, and maybe I can delve more into it. Thank you.
Thank you for. Over to you.
Can you hear me?
I can, yes.
Okay, it's an honor for me to be here. And I would like to thank all of you here. And directly I will go to my topic and just read out from my notes in order not to take much of your time. Let me speak in simple terms about this matter of the impact of US policy in Ethiopia, because it really is quite simple. When the TPLF was toppled by a youth movement calling for democracy, the US claimed that supporting a democratic transition from an authoritarian regime was a foreign policy priority. In that case, anchoring support in civil society support should have been the first line of defense for stability. It was not to be. Instead, US policy became focused on support of the person of Abiy Ahmed and international attention to competing external powers. As a result, the US abandoned attention and investment in civil society. The impact of that decision is social rupture, devastation, violence, and war. These were avoidable consequences. The question is now a road to repair. What happened and what did not happen at the local level during Abiy's tenure was that civil society was the scene of insecurity and desperation. The US did not intervene. It watched from the sidelines, granting Abiy full diplomatic, military, and security support. The violence, destruction, and disinformation that thrived in the absence of independent investigation and the near blackout conditions has been shocking. This is an area where I have abundant first-hand information and experience. And so what happened at the local level to the kind of structures that needed to be strengthened and supported on the ground in order for democratic institutions to have the capacity to bear a serious transition to democracy in Ethiopia. US representatives, the ambassador, diplomatic corps became strong enthusiasts and backers of Abiy himself and failed to recognize or support the Kero movement and other groups who brought change. The US appeared to personalize its endorsement. They indulged him, praised him, empowered him, and funded his government, provided him diplomatic and strategic support on the assurance he gave them that he was a reliable US ally and a democracy. Throughout this transition, in giving so much attention to the person of young Prime Minister, US ignored the rural areas and failed to provide similar support to the efforts of the thousands of youth who initiated the breakthrough. While the US was looking to the Middle East and China and Egypt, Abiy declared war on Western Oromia and then on Tigray. His war on Oromia amounted to a full-scale assault on the US. I should not have to remind representatives of the United States government or NGOs of the critical importance of civil society to democracy. Ethiopian civil society was overlooked as a reliable partner. The claims for a democratic transition never really went anywhere. But how? I could provide first-hand accounts of how organizing party activities was thwarted, offices closed, workers harassed, and disappeared. What happened to the Guerrero after that day when the youth turned out to welcome me and the other released prisoners in February 2018? They could not register to organize any social or economic initiative or activity. The subversion of election in the period leading to our arrest in June 2020 was carried out with virtually no US assistance to building election capacity. The Abiy government simply imprisoned us and declared victory. I think the international community, particularly the US, had a vague hope and naive idea that they were going forward into a democratic transition. That is what was promised. But as the many diplomats recounted in their interviews with Mike, the moderator, the US was asleep at the wheel and did not even notice how unwood the country had become, where the vehicle was headed. There are lessons to be learned and policy to be adjusted from that experience. Civil society strengthening is the solution to the current problem. The US relied on Abiy to make good on his promises to transition to democracy. However, Abiy was openly suspicious of civil society. He moved to control every aspect of civil life, down to the family level unit, trying to root out the youth who had experience in resistance to ensure that they did not turn on him and his government. Those partners are still there in the country, but it's going to take intentional effort and investment to do that. We have seen what kind of targeting and obstacles registered parties face from the OFC, my own party president. Is the US willing to attempt to correct this debacle by supporting and investing in capacity building? And the US shift gears? How would that shift work? It would require the US participating in an active conversation to build a democratic state. To do this, we need partners. I propose that the US chooses to pivot toward encouraging rather than dismantling grassroots organizing. Those of us who work to build up civil society institutions would make excellent partners. We would relay strong signals to the society into organizing success. The Oromo naturally formed the kind of partnerships that can come from a really engaged civil society. Quite bluntly, the US had raised the expectations of democracy. US had brought the country to the brink of a democratic transition. Instead of supporting and investing and seeing the potential here, they made the strategic blunder to give all assets, all capability, all diplomatic support, all financial investment to one unknown prime minister and created a monster. The US empowered a man who would actually destroy the capacity of the country to achieve its ambition. The US enabled Abiy to create authoritarian regime. The situation has now gone beyond the point where the US they can put him back. What can they do? They need to understand loss is the loss of civil society structures where people can live their lives in peace. When this is unmoored, as it is now, local, countrywide, and regional stability is not. The mistake of the US was taking their eyes off of the largest population in Ethiopia, the rural areas where the massive population of the second biggest country in the continent resides. They looked instead towards China, the Middle East, Russia, Iran, and other places attending to the global competition. By doing this, they lost the foundation for democracy. This connects with what Fatima said. The key issue here is the one I asked about. Is the United States ready and willing to recalibrate its policy? Is the US ready to go to a relationship-based foreign policy, which keeps the bigger issues in mind, but has traction and connection among the population that will put back to where US policy has been perceived in its most positive light? Thank you.
Thank you, Bakela. So, Faisal, I will turn it over to you.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you. I assume the panelists can as well in the audience.
Yes, thank you very much, Michael, for the introduction. And I would like to take a minute to thank Susan and Josh to join us while they could do something else on this beautiful Saturday. I just like to touch some historical background to show where I think America has missed the boat in terms of its diplomacy and policy towards the Horn of Africa. And I'm one of those people who lived through time to witness America's often mistaken policies. I came to a refugee displaced from Ethiopia, Jigjiga, in 1981. And arriving in Los Angeles, my world of that yesteryear somehow seems to be similar to the current situation after 40 plus years. I started a small clerk job at a 7-Eleven when I came. And one day while I was clerking, the owner called me and said, a big man is out there waiting for you to talk. I found out that he was a US congressional member. I cannot recall his name, but he sat with me for a good 30 minutes and deliberated with me as to my experience and how I see things and what had happened in the area that I came from, and gave me a level of comfort and encouragement. And with that encouragement, I pursued my education, joined the UCLA, and since then became active in the Horn of Africa politics. One day at UCLA, the late James S. Coleman, one of the founding fathers of the African Studies Association, and indeed the founder of the African Studies Center at UCLA, invited me to his 11th floor at the Bench Hall for a coffee. While I was there with him conversing on general issues about Ethiopia and the Horn of Africa, he received a very important call and he said, Faisal, let me pick up this phone call. Believe it or not, the phone call was from Poland. It was from Lech Walesa, who was the leader of the Solidarity movement. Then and at that time, as a young man, I learned that institutions and research centers in America have a weight that most of us don't see. They sway public policy in the United States and diplomacy. They also closely work with the State Department and the policy formulation leaders. And since then, I give credit and credence to those of you who really want to listen to us. 40 years ago at UCLA again, the African Studies Department hosted a very important conference called Crisis on the Horn, 40 years ago. And it really showed Farrell, who wrote the Clouds of War on the Horn, but the conference depicted two Ethiopians at the time, Berekat Haile Selassie, and who was a known quantity in terms of the theoretization of the Horn of Africa and diplomacy, and Nuguse Ayele, who was at the time spokesperson for the DER, and also himself a UCLA graduate. The two people really debated on issues that today those of us who are sitting here probably would be debating. What is the role of the US? Why the US side is with a government that is at war with its own people, and the other side saying the US should maintain its diplomatic relationship with Ethiopia because Ethiopia, for good or bad, it's an anchor to the US policy. In general, Ethiopia is really a complex country. It's a complex not only to outsiders, but also a complex to those of us who grew up and have a lived experience. On the one hand, it's a country that attracts and mesmerizes the memories and imaginations of the West because to them, it's the only African country that's close to the West's version of civilization. To some Ethiopians, Ethiopia is the only imperial force in the continent. And to those of us in the east of Ethiopia, such as the Ogaden region. It's a recent colonial power. As you know, that the Somali region in Ethiopia was incorporated to Ethiopia in 1954. My father had a marriage certificate with my mom that was signed by a British consulate that was in Jigjiga at the time. It's that recent, and those issues, the imperiality of Ethiopia, the civilization that mesmerizes some of the Westerners, which look a single story of Ethiopian exceptionalism, and those of us who see the recent Ethiopia, all of us do have a different version of what Ethiopia is. But what and who are the people and the countries of the Horn of Africa? That is probably of interest to this panel. The Horn of Africa region, as we know, comprises Somalia, Eritrea, Djibouti, Ethiopia, Sudan, and Kenya. This is a troubled region from historical point of view. It has and it still remains the scars of the scramble for Africa and the vestiges of the Second World War, and the 21st century's renewed revival of the Cold War. I'm mentioning the Second World War because two major things happened besides the history that we often repeat about Ethiopia. One, it came close to a creation of an Oromo state at the end of the Second World War. There was the Oromo Republic that was organized by the Italian, and if that had continued and succeeded, Oromia today would have been a different country. That's number one. And number two, the Somali incorporation into Ethiopia became literally part of the fabric of Ethiopia's politics, and we are here today for that too. The complexity of the Ethiopian situation is today to be fashioned, in my opinion, by something that both the West and the Ethiopian political elite ignore. While Ethiopia is the second most populous country, which we always repeat and say whenever we are writing something or speaking, there is an omission here that we conveniently do so. At the same time, Oromo is probably, if not the single largest ethnic or national group in the continent, it's the second. If you combine the Hausa Fulani and make that group as one grouping, then Oromo would become the second largest, 40 million people whose awakening just is as young as it could be. Whereas the Somali nationalism is somewhat a bit matured, and if you will, that it is all the age. The Oromo nationalism is to be reckoned, and if political opinion makers and policy makers in the West don't hear the cries of the Oromo youth, as Fatuma put it, or Pakale Gabra's analysis of what has happened in the Ethiopian transition, then I think the US and the West would miss a huge opportunity in the coming few years. Now, in the last 30 years, the region of the Horn of Africa has seen collapsed states such as Somalia, or semi-collapsed states in Ethiopian case, or in, for that matter, Eritrea. And if the Ethiopian state collapses or continues to stay on the track of being collapsed, and anybody can argue that it has more or less from socio-political point of view collapsed, then we are looking at the population that we often cite, Ethiopia being as the second largest and most populous country, which has a connotation of, richness in terms of potential commercial. That huge population could be weaponized, and dislocations could take place and disrupt the entire Horn of Africa. Suppose 15% of the Ethiopian population gets displaced in the case that Ethiopia disintegrates or collapses. What you are looking at is an avalanche of people, particularly Oromo people, flooding Somalia, Djibouti, Kenya, that could possibly have a long-term impact on the region. And the consequences of that could take the US and other Western countries a huge effort to contain and even help. Having said that, I think in the current geopolitical reality, the Horn of Africa remains an enigma at best and a challenge to the US policy, and it has been a challenge for a while. How does the US therefore remain relevant to both those that rule the region, meaning people who are in the power, as Bakale was talking about, at the same time help the democratic transition, which we all agree that at once in 2018, it started to be teetering at the seams. I think we need to recognize, in order to answer some of those questions, that the US cannot, and I will really underline that, cannot sustain its foreign policy only by prioritizing its military interests. In the era where the people of the region are getting more educated, more integrated, linked to the global world, having communities in the United States and lobbying, the old militaristic approach to the Horn of Africa is a passé. It cannot sustain, nor will it serve the US interest from the greater picture. Historically, US foreign policy has failed, in my opinion, to win friends from the masses of the Horn of Africa. It always, most of the time, starting from Haile Selassie to a certain degree with the Derg, maintained good, if not, at times challenging relationship with the rulers, but it always came short in winning the hearts and minds of the people that it really wants to help. And as a US citizen who has thrived and loved this country, I don't doubt the intent of the US to help, but I think we probably are using the wrong methodologies and the wrong tools here. The US government and its policies towards Ethiopia never centered either the Oromo or the Cushitic groups that are probably close to 70% of the people. Now that at that 70%, the tortured and maligned and literally massacred Tigray population, you have the Ethiopian majority to the tune of 75 people looking and longing for a system that can serve all of us, and that is probably a more democratic federal system, despite all the propagandistic things that we hear, such as Ethiopia is being killed by ethnic federalism. And there is nothing, and you will hear that tomorrow probably, there is nothing of the word of ethnic in the Ethiopian constitution. There are nations and nationalities and composed that country. Therefore, a successful US engagement in Ethiopia must include politics of equity and social justice, where the majority's voices are heard, while the other voices are also accommodated. What we have been accustomed to in the last half a century, if you will, since 1945, when the Ethio-US policy cemented and sent its roots deep, the US government has been listening to one very vocal and powerful voice, and that excludes most of the people that make up the Ethiopian demography. The US government has been kind to Ethiopia, both politically as well as materially. In particular, the monetary cost that the US gives to the Ethiopian government then and now is one that really does not promote what makes America's #1 political commodity, and that is democratic ethos. America prides itself on being the mother and father of democratic systems. When it goes to Ethiopia, it inadvertently undermines its own ethos. For example, in 1977, when the Derg declared itself to be a hardcore Marxist-Leninist regime and signed a military pact with the then Soviet Union, America still stayed true to its often undeclared prioritization of militaristic interests and continued to aid the Derg both materially as well as politically. A regime that finally ended up killing thousands of its own citizens. The US, in essence, enabled the Derg to acquire hard currency and other financial processes to them be able to stay in power longer and purge more people and longer and go on for that, on that course. Barakat Abdesselassie, who was at the time an Ethiopian but now a full-fledged Eritrean, wrote in 1980 this: with the advent of the massive Soviet arms infusion into Ethiopia beginning in 1977, US aid through AID and the World Bank shifted to the economic side to still continue with monetary rewards. Barakat argues that such support emboldened the Derg to strengthen its alliance with the Soviet Union diplomatically and still continue its domestic mayhem against its own people at the home front. The Derg's status to deal with both superpowers comfortably prompted Barakat to retort this. Is the US and the Soviet in cahoots with each other to keep Ethiopia the way it is? I think that was a bit of the cuffs, but Senator Henry Jackson, a Cold War liberal, and many others in the league at that time wondered whether Jimmy Carter and the US were suffering from what they call lack of will. I think, and I'm 100% sure today in some circles in Washington, that terminology, the lack of will by the United States to promote democracy in the Horn of Africa is in circulation. In their 2022 excellent piece, Who Lost Ethiopia, Harry Farnon and Michael Waldemariam also in a very diplomatic way make this point. They argue that the US policymakers continue a policy of appeasement of the current leader of Ethiopia, just like in the 1970s. The current administration enjoys, in my opinion, the cachet of the Soviet, Turkey, China, Iran, while it also gets very handsome cash from the United States of America directly or indirectly. The US administration seems to be comfortable with pumping money to a regime that it knows it's also very close to the Soviet Union. The ascendance of Dr. Abiy Ahmed to the premiership of Ethiopia in April 2018 ushered an unprecedented political change. Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed quickly transferred power from TPLF, EPRDF, from TPLF-dominated Ethiopian People's Revolutionary Front to its hitherto junior OPDO. The Economist wrote a very pregnant piece in 2018 December and said Prime Minister Abiy has acted quickly, lifting a state of emergency, freeing thousands of people, political prisoners, and vowing to hold fair elections in 2020. He has signed a peace deal with Eritrea, whose the intent, in many opinions, was to bring Eritrea back to the world. That didn't work. I think it is always painful as a scholar and commentator to be an outlier. I think I was one of those people who was outliers at the time when everybody was praising Dr. Abiy and his reforms, simply because when I listened to his speeches, I didn't feel comfortable. But in 2018 July, I was traveling from Addis to Nairobi. Next to me was sitting a young Tigrenya doctor who clicked relation with me right away because she was a doctor one time in my hometown. This is July 2018, and Abiy was only a few months in power. She confided in me then that her people were leaving Addis Ababa in droves. Tigrenya middle class were feeling the negative vibe from Aret Kilo. And I wrote an article where I was highlighting what that young lady shared with me. But I also said there is the possibility that hate-based massacre could happen in Ethiopia. It happened that few days before I traveled to Ethiopia, I visited the West Los Angeles Holocaust Museum, where I watched a little movie clip that shows the conversation that was taking place in Hamburg and in the entire Germany towns, where the Jewish people could see the purge and the pogrom coming, and when they confide with their friends who were upper class Germans, what they sensed their friends from good point of view were saying, no, this could not happen to you guys. By the time that happened to the Jews, it was too late to do anything. I think what we have seen in Ethiopia in 2020 and beyond, what happened in Tigray, what's happening in Oromia at this point in time, was something that some of us who know, started my speech, who believed that it could happen, were ignored by the international world and our diplomats in the US corps, particularly the US embassy in Addis Ababa, not only ignored, but supported that campaign that was coming to purge the Ethiopian masses. I don't want to take more time, but I would have liked to just quickly do some reflections on what's happening with the Al-Shabaab incursion into the region and what I believe to be as a solution. I think this is again Al-Shabaab, emboldened, sees how Ethiopia is weakened, and the fact that there is no security intelligence, that they have been transporting weapons and troops in the last 4 or 5 months. And now all of us believe that despite the incursion and the defeat of Al-Shabaab's contingent that came in the last few days, but they have already passed and established some bases in the mountains. A way out, number one, America should start listening to the noises, should not only listen to the loudest noises, it has to start listening to other voices such as the Oromo Somali voice, and host and open its doors to the southern groups that are really being here wronged. Number two, I think we need a robust and timely diplomatic work to forge a common front consisting of Somali and Somali special forces and youth police to fight and pursue the Al-Shabaab. But I like one important issue that I like to just add to this, and that is the US State Department Africa Bureau needs to revisit its manual and see if they can update their manual towards the Horn of Africa and shift from the romantic approach to Ethiopia to the current reality of what Ethiopia is, what its demographics is. We consider the Oromia the belly of the hyena, if you will. And I think re-emphasizing how to tame and work with the belly and those who are around that belly could issue us some roadmap. But to come and update its manual, I don't think they have, the Africa Bureau updated its manual. And lastly, for all the aid, this positive note to end, all the aid and billions of dollars that it continues to give in relief forms, and we cannot really underemphasize the positive contribution that the US does, although we see its diplomacy often wrong when it comes to the Horn of Africa. And thank you very much for listening.
Great, thank you, Faisal, and again, thank you, Fatuma Bekele as well for your opening interventions. A lot has been put on the table. It's difficult to know where to begin. So let me do this. Let me pose a question to the three speakers and have them, but before, sort of think about their responses to that question, and then before they answer, I'll turn to Josh and Susan for their opening reflections, right? So that's how we'll proceed. So my question to Fatuma Bekele and Faisal, I think very tough, blunt assessment of US policy as it's evolved, 2018, even before 2018, right? And I wonder if, I guess one sort of, for the sake of argument, I think one response or one caveat, I think, to the sort of these tough assessments would be that US policy has changed somewhat, right? Or one would argue in fairly significant ways since 2018, since the embrace of the new administration. We had an election in the United States. The Biden administration has come in. So there have been a lot of shifts in US policy towards Ethiopia and the Horn. And I would like the three of you to sort of take stock of those changes, and how do you assess shifting US posture on Ethiopia in the crisis? As the crisis has deepened, policies have changed. Again, we've had a new administration come in. A special envoy was deployed. We've had 3 of them, 3 different people filling that slot. And some would argue the United States has taken a more proactive approach to managing or helping to resolve Ethiopia's very serious challenges. So how do you assess this? What's been good about that? What's not? And then, so think about your responses to that particular question. And then Josh and Susan, I obviously want to bring you in. Do you have any? First of all, I just say, do you have any sort of opening reflections on what you've heard, or just anything you want to sort of say off the top? And then my question to you both would be, could you sort of shed some light on sort of what are the domestic, well, I mean domestic in the U.S. sense here, or sort of global factors that have been shaping U.S. engagement on Ethiopia over the past couple of years, really since 2018? Sort of, if we zoom out from Ethiopia in the region, what are some of these other exogenous variables that are affecting U.S. engagement in Ethiopia? Thanks.
Thanks very much. Yeah, there's a lot here. Frantically scribbling notes as I listened to the remarks, and thank you for all those, and thank you to your managers for having me. It really is a pleasure to be here. I'll be quick because we got a lot to cover, and not a lot of time. A few things jumped out at me when listening to the opening remarks. First, I wholeheartedly agree that the U.S., particularly the State Department, I think, is institutionally inclined to engage and talk to other governments. That's just simply a reality of how the U.S. State Department works. I wish it would indeed consult more broadly than it does. I think the point about missing an opportunity in particularly talking about youth movements, other youth movements is well taken. I also, something that struck me about throughout this conflict, especially, and even before the conflicts, during all the tumults that brought Abiy's power eventually, was how little insight we had. I remember when the conflict broke out in Tigray, and the United States was blind in many ways about what was going on, and that was partly the United States' fault. We hadn't cultivated relationships we should have. I remember being shocked by some of the assessments that came out of the State Department that endorsed the idea that this was going to be a quick law enforcement operation. And I just, again, I think that was a reflection of how little the U.S. government understood about facts on the ground, and that's always a challenge for the United States. So there's a saying that I really like, and I'll paraphrase it here. Don't assume evil intentions when incompetence could be an explanation. And I think that's partly what's been going on. It is hard, and it's not an easy problem set anyways to begin with. But then you add on some errors, and suddenly you have a very negative confluence of factors that creates an insufficient response. But with that said, I do want to try to get a sense of the dilemma that the United States faces in these sort of situations. I've talked to many representatives of various groups involved in this conflict, including on opposite sides of it, and they all say the U.S. hasn't been supportive enough of their side and has been too supportive of the other side. That's literally every side said that. So the U.S. is trying to find a balance here that's frankly or to make The other sort of central dilemma that the United States has is that it's not the only actor in these conflicts. Well, it probably never was, but it's not even the most decisive actor, foreign actor. We can talk about middle powers that actually, in my estimation, have more influence in places like Ethiopia than the United States does. The Emiratis, for instance, or the Turks, and the Chinese, right, which is a major focal point of American foreign policy. That's just a reality, and that's not going to change because American foreign policy is designed to protect the interests of the United States. And China has accepted as a threat to the global interests of the United States. So when the U.S. engages in these environments, it will always be concerned about global competitors like China, like Iran. Turkey is sort of problematic for the United States. So that's always going to be part of the conversation for the United States. And as an American, I think that's proper and correct for the U.S. to be concerned about that. So that the dilemma becomes if the United States is overly supportive of a regime like Abiy's, which may well have empowered some of his actions. I agree with that. But if it has not been supportive of Abiy during his rise, if it's withdrawn, there's always other actors that are very happy to step in and fill that role, including ones that are negative for the United States, and I would argue are negative for the broader Ethiopian population. I also remember the U.S. was not alone in being very excited about Abiy's rise. I remember his trip to the United States. I remember how the diaspora came out and rallied around him. It was very inspiring for everybody. I do think the United States focuses too much on personalities and individuals. I wholeheartedly agree that the focus should be on institutions, on civil society. Those are hopefully the structures that bring stability and will outlast any individual movement. And so if you can institutionalize good practices within civil society, within institutions, then you have a much better chance of stability, of democratic rule. That was sort of, there's so many things I was trying to get there, but I'll leave it there. Yes.
Good morning, everybody, and thank you for the invitation. It's really a privilege to be here on a Saturday and to join the panel and to have an opportunity to hear from all of you as well. Maybe I'll just say before I start that the U.S. Institute of Peace is an independent federal institution, and so neither Josh nor I speak for the United States government. Neither of us has the privilege or responsibility to make policy. We have the opportunity to ask hard questions and to make suggestions, I think in a similar way that you do as well. Just reflecting on the questions that you asked, Mike, and the conversation, it strikes me that the United States faces a real challenge in figuring out how to support political transitions. And beyond the crises in Ethiopia, we've seen a wave of coups across the continent. There are areas where there is certainly progress and consolidation of democracy, but I think that it's incredibly difficult, even in the best moments. But a few things strike me as particular dilemmas to calibrate. One, as Josh was just saying, how to balance between investing in institutions, which we know are critical foundations for democracy, political accountability, accountable governance, with a real need for leadership. I fully agree. We get too caught up in individuals. At the same time, without leadership, institutions have a very, very difficult time. I think there's also a challenge in forging a minimum agreement on a vision of what does the political transition look like, while still acknowledging that pluralism, political pluralism, different views, diverging political perspectives is the foundation for democracy. And at times, I think when transitions begin, people put a higher premium on that common vision forward than being able to create the foundation for pluralism. And I think that's very dangerous. But I see it happen in other countries as well. I also think that we underestimate the challenge of moving from countries and societies where security is managed in a very traditional sense, with the use of force and closed space, to the time and the building from civil society up, from political leadership sideways, that takes to really move into a country that feels safe for its people and for the region again. And none of this is an excuse for how decisions are made, but as I look across the Horn of Africa, as I look across the continent, as I look across the world, I think it's very difficult to get this right. And it's something that requires constant adaptation of policy and approaches. It requires fundamentally knowing how to define the problem and the opportunities, which means talking to people and listening to people in a way that looks different. The other thing I note just in opening remarks is that I noticed that there are some really significant changes in the Horn of Africa and more broadly in Africa. One, I think many of these have come up, but there is an activated youth population. We've talked about the youth bulge and the economic demands and needs that this creates. I don't think we talk enough about the political expectations that young people have and the energy of that. And when you're speaking about the programs, I think that's an incredible energy. But our diplomatic communities, not just the United States, but more broadly, I don't think has figured out how to interact with social movements that they don't fully understand. Practice works well when there is a clear point of contact, when there is a clear hierarchy. And there is work that needs to be done to figure out how to engage with politically mobilized and interested groups when it looks different than what we're used to dealing with. Again, this is an excuse, but I see this as a pattern in other places. I think we also have a challenge in understanding how do protest movements, social movements relate to political leaders. What does that mean in terms of how the United States and other diplomats should engage with them? I think everybody's talked about the new influencers, but certainly the world changed in February of this year in terms of the overall, we can call it the global order. I think that's what we called it before, but we can put those in quotation marks. And I think what we saw in the months before that, years before that, was really multilateralism in crisis in the Horn of Africa. And the inability of the institutions that were built for peace and security to respond to the challenges that existed. And I think that this really remains a significant challenge. So in addition to the conversations about how to bring the voices of Ethiopians, of all Ethiopians, into defining what their political system looks like, what their political future looks like, I think there's also a very important conversation about how the region works together and what are those, how do the multilateral structures, how do the peace and security structures adapt to respond to some of these new realities. Right, let me stop there for a moment.
Great, thank you. So let me turn to Fatuma Bekele and Faisal to see. I mean, you may want to build on some things that Josh and Susan have said. I obviously posed a question to you three about about sort of changes in U.S. policy, particularly since the change in administration. And sort of your assessment of those changes. So I'll leave it to you all.
I think both Josh and Susan summed up American foreign policy, what American foreign policy is informed and motivated by. I think we can all agree that those are all true, and their assessment is actually pretty spot on. A lot of the times when we see happenings around the world, we, as Oromos or, as people who have come from these countries in turmoil, we, we see from a very moral lens, and it's very personal. And so we have very personal emotional responses because these are our families in harm's way. With America, American foreign policy changes very little in my opinion when it comes to third world countries, especially Horn of Africa, countries like Ethiopia who have an anchor states for the United States. And the United States is primarily motivated by its personal interest, military or otherwise. But I think the key issue here, where even pursuing personal interests, you can see some feelings where I think Josh pointed out that a lot of times it isn't just intent of people, it could be ignorant. And I would attest to that because these diplomatic circles are not really engaging with key players within these states. Like, for example, within Ethiopia, they're completely ignoring a very important subset of political movers within Ethiopia. By not engaging fully the youth movement, by not engaging other players within the Ethiopian state, you're missing a very crucial part of your assessment of the country. Because if I am looking out for the interests of my country, the United States, then I think presumably would want Ethiopia to be a stable state. For that to happen, as you have noted, things are changing really fast within Ethiopia and foreign states in general. There's a huge subset of youth who are very politically conscious, who have a clear vision of what they want, and they are mobilizing themselves. Like, for example, with the Arrow movement or youth movement, mass movement, and with the derailment of their mass movement, a lot of them have chosen to take up arms because a lot of them were behind in their own homes. So that leads to proliferation of conflict and armed struggle, and that leads to instability. So I think the United States policy with the new administration hasn't changed much. I think because of some of the decisions and some of the court decisions made, actually doubling down on saving the current regime, because as you said, that the interest is really in preserving the leader, and these things continue. But if you don't shift your focus to what is actually causing, leading to these wars or these conflicts or these destabilizing factors within the country, then you need to reassess your approach to it and engage these actors. And so what the United States can do now, and what we, the Oromo, have continuously been saying for years, and I would like to say earlier, the Oromo nationalism is young. I don't think it's young. It's been coming for decades and decades. It's pretty old and very mature and very objective, like has a clear objective of what it wants to accomplish. And that Oromo question has been an existential question with Ethiopia. Ethiopia cannot foresee its stability until it addresses the Oromo question, because Oromo is the core of the Ethiopian state. And so I would like to leave that first question, but I don't really see the American foreign policy changing that much, generally speaking.
Well, following Faisal's comment earlier, I would also like to thank the United States for whatever they've done and whatever they do with the good intent. The problem is this was where the United States have one seat. Not only the United States, not only governments, we ourselves as Ethiopians were deceived right after the ascendance of the new prime minister in power. We all supported at the initial stages because we thought that something great, something important, as he was very little known in the political arena at that time, we all hoped that something better will happen to the country. So after the Biden administration, we see some changes. In fact, there are some changes, but still the changes are not enough because mainly the main engine of the reform, the care of the youth, has been completely forgotten. Not only forgotten, but they were sought after. They were being killed in prison on a daily basis. We see mass killings in Oromia. I think they're not very certain that this is continuing by the state. Extrajudicial killings are rampant. They are going on still. I don't think this is not. This is out of the knowledge of the United States. At least they know. But nothing has happened to restrain. We know in around 2020, a lot of money have been rejected, and Abiy himself has got a lot of aid, a lot of support from the American government. And by now, even though we see some change in part, but we don't see reality that is really of particular importance. Then it could have been, they would have done better. Because, for example, the American government was pushing so that peace talks will take their land and the government, government. But when it comes to the Oromo Liberation Army, this has not, the US is not pushing in the way it pushes to sit down and negotiate with the PPLF. Even there is no mention of that. Usually, in their policies and in the bills, even there are very little mentions of the Oromo. Yet, being big majority in the country is politically minority. This is how it is being viewed by the United States. If this doesn't change, lasting peace, enduring peace cannot be there in the country. This is impossible. So that is what this is the same as trying to drive a car taking out the jeep, leaving out the care of. I don't think lasting peace will prevail in that country. That is the only thing. Abiy is consolidating his power at the expense of destroying the institutions. We people who live in the country, we see that there are no institutions. It is only one man show, it's only one person. He's doing everything, going into every orbit and ordering anything. That's it. This is not democracy. This cannot be cannot pass unnoticed. This is publicly known by the people in the country and also by the policymakers here. So that is where we want to draw attention. Yes, the name, having got all the credit for the thing he has not brought about. It is the girl who died. It's the youth who paid the sacrifices. The little known or unknown person ascended to power, and he thought that these are the potential movers that can challenges government in the future. Therefore, he said, cracking down on them, hunting them on a daily basis. And that is continuing in the country. And this is nothing has been done from this side. That is where we want to go that future. Thank you, sir.
Faisal, if you have anything to add, please do so. Maybe if you can do it concisely.
I will. Yeah. No, I think U.S. Policymakers need to look at themselves very seriously. This is a huge failure. What happened in Tigray, what's happening now in Oromia, and the U.S. Embassy just actively engaging. What would they say tomorrow if they were assembled and asked to explain to us U.S. citizens what their role was? They can't just say that Abiy did this and the U.S. government was trying to convince him not to kill so many people. No, I don't think that will fly. I think an indication of our failure towards Ethiopia is measured by the magnitude of the problems and atrocities. And I think we have seen what had happened. What can the US do is really the question at this point in time. How can the US assist in completing the transition? There are some hopes that I like to serve as signs not to give up tomorrow or the coming few days. The TPLF Ethiopia talks will start in Nairobi. I think the US needs to put all its force behind that conference and those talking to work, and I'm sure they are doing that. But at the same time, to bring in other big giants such as the Oromo. This unilateral talks between two sides is not going to give Ethiopia any peace. I think they need to expand the table, include more people. I do understand that technically somebody saying that we have to do piece by piece and approach this slowly. But while we are closing one side of the avalanche and the pile, or another side that's opening up and creating a mess. So I think I would want the US government to pay more attention to that. And I have nothing to add, but I think the youth you're right. I think there is restlessness among the Oromo youth, but also other youth. Where I come from, there is no job creation activity going on for the youth. One of the reasons why Al-Shabaab incursion took place this time is for 6-7 months. Al-Shabaab has been working through networks to engage and handle and take some youth in the Afdar, Liban, that area, under Al-Shabaab wing. So, the problems are huge, but I think our work is cut out for, and I don't have at this point in time, a quick solution. There's one Somali proverb that I just like to throw in. You can think. There's a proverb that says, if you try to cure a horse with a medicine intended for the donkey, that horse will always remain sick. So for the last 40 years, as I argued, we've been trying the same method. We need to change that, and we need to come up with new approaches to the Ethiopian situation.
Great, thanks. So I think this discussion has actually sort of addressed the follow-up question I had, which was really sort of policy solutions, right? And where U.S. policy should go from here. And a lot of the main concern right now is around the issue of reconciliation, right? Putting the social fabric together. Ethiopia, of course, appears to be now a very socially polarized country, diverse country. Various ideological viewpoints that need to be reconciled. And so, what practical steps can U.S. policymakers take to facilitate reconciliation across this vast ideological divide? I think part of what I hear some of the panelists arguing for is to make sure that we have a political process here that's inclusive, right? If there's anything else that folks want to add in terms of logical steps that U.S. policymakers can take, or things that they should support, I think that would be useful to hear now or going forward. We do have a number of questions that have come surprise to the panelists. So in the interest of time, why don't I also put some of those questions to you all? And so I'm reading these unfiltered, just putting them to you directly. So one is a fairly direct question. In some ways, it's been addressed already by the panelists, but you can reflect more on it if you'd like. Why has US foreign policy continued to tilt to one side? Is there a lack of data or assessment of the region? So that's one question. A second question is, and this was addressed to all the panelists, the rule of law is a contract between citizens and a government. In Ethiopia, the government is the one that breaks its own rules of law. For example, the political prisoners, Mr. Abdi Ragasa, Michael Boran, and other senior OLF political prisoners are repeatedly set free by the courts of law. In Abdi's case, 7 times. Yet the US is silent when it comes to Oromo political prisoners. Why should, put it quite bluntly, why should the Oromo people consider the US as a partner? So those are 2 questions, and then I put a more general query to you about policy solutions and what practical steps US policymakers should take at this moment in time. So I'll turn it over to the panelists if there's any interventions on these points.
I guess I'll add one. It might sound like a broken record, but I think one policy solution would be to engage all of the actors within the political space within Ethiopia, specifically the youth movement, the opposition political parties who are operating under extremely dangerous situations back home. A lot of their members and leaders are some of them pursuing as examples, taking and championing their human rights, I think, in one way, and strengthening civil society, as Bulakara has suggested previously, and just having an overall comprehensive understanding of local realities within the structural issues that have kept some of the political space, where a lot of that circle for the historical issues that have led to the proliferation of conflict and dispute within the political space. And I think just having a more informed approach to dealing with Ethiopia, whether it be with different actors such as the opposition, the youth movement, but also the government, the people in power. I think an informed approach would go a very long way in having and helping push Ethiopia towards a more stable, more reconciliatory political reality, I would say.
Well, trying to find out data in Ethiopia is not matter. As you know, in the western part of Ethiopia, for example, there was a time when there was a complete blackout for 3 months, and nobody knew what happened in that part of the world. Nobody knows what kind of atrocities were committed. Nobody knows. Everyone knows. Yeah. So it is the amount of the level of disinformation from the government media in the other media is also so confusing for policymakers. For the United States, it's not simple, it's not simple to get accurate data. That's how we might do in that place. And also the government has its own people who can do this job and usually is informed or deliberately is informed. And then there are also medias. We complained about the media so many times. I remember going to George Place, and also I complained that time that are here in the United States and that play a great role part for all the problems we see in that country, and also the government media. And therefore, I think when we come to the data, I would admit that it's very difficult to get accurate data. And also they do ask us as political parties mostly accurate data that we find it as being difficult to assess. But for whatever data available, the action has been very slow, that is what we say. From whatever enough data available, the action has been so slow. And hopefully this can be because of priority matters, as they say. But hopefully now we are here to make sure that the policymakers will listen to us, and the magnitude of the problem is so huge that they cannot take their eyes off Oromia like they did in the past, and it's now time to act.
Great. So I don't know if there's other interventions on this point or others, but let me pose another question. This comes directly from the audience. It's a bit of a long question, so I apologize. So I think it speaks in some ways to sort of, arguably sort of internal divisions in sort of the U.S. government approach to Ethiopia. So the question is, the U.S. has always had a doctrinal approach to conducting its foreign policy to protect its interests. The doctrine changes based on the prevailing threat assessment. This has failed in the questionnaires assessment to serve the U.S. national interest under Haile Selassie and more recently the EPRDF and the Prosperity Party. Today, U.S. foreign policy goals include security and stability in the Red Sea region, fighting global terrorism, and countering China's increasing influence in the Horn. In recent months, this doctrinal approach from the State Department has clashed with the ground level realistic approach of the special envoys. The State Department has won out, leading to the resignation. Consequently, U.S. policy towards the Horn has been a disastrous failure in the questionnaires assessment. Would the U.S. reconsider its approach to the local reality perspective to improve its chances of success? End of question. So that was actually directed, I don't think I mentioned this up front, to Susan and Josh. So if you want to weigh in on that, you can, and others on the panel, feel free to weigh in on this question as well.
I think often when we're engaging with our colleagues in the U.S. government, we are trying to draw lines between policy priorities that are articulated for the entire government. So the democracy agenda, the commitment to preventing conflict and promoting stability, the new approach that the administration has said that they will take on that globally, and drawing forward examples and expectations where countries need to be brought in line with that. So very shortly, you can't say you're supporting a democracy agenda and then take actions that appear to be counter to that in other circumstances. So I think that's part of the conversation that needs to take place. I think the security priorities, I don't think will go away. And one of the challenges I find is figuring out how to balance the real urgency to address either a security threat, a perceived security threat, or humanitarian crisis, and the need for crisis diplomacy approaches to address those, and the way that diverts from developing long-term coherent strategies. You would think that in a very large government, you could do both things at the same time. But I think the reality is that it requires different spaces to think about those long-term strategic questions. And in my mind, that's a really important role that global studies association, hopefully our institutions, need to play, because we are not sitting and making decisions and executing policy every day. We have the privilege to step back. I wonder, can I like say something quick about your previous question in terms of policy ideas?
Yes, no, please, you want to respond to that question?
Yeah, if I may.
Yes, yes, please, absolutely.
Three quick things. One, I think generally speaking, there's an approach to say that civil society support or political party support is done through assistance. It's done through partners and providing funding. And often there is a disconnect between that assistance, those programs, and the diplomatic messaging. And I think there is a need to tighten that up for a couple of reasons. One, if you're providing assistance and your diplomatic public messaging do not align or seem contradictory, then that's quite problematic. Secondly, those who are implementing that kind of assistance programming, whether it's support to civil society or otherwise, have really important insights about what is happening. And I do want to acknowledge there is programming in Ethiopia. It may not be the right programming or sufficient programming, but there is programming engagement in support of moving towards a more inclusive political process. And so I think it would be really helpful to get very granular about, is it that what's being done is not the right thing to be done? Is it that it's not enough? Is it that it's disconnected or perhaps even not driving sufficiently the diplomatic messaging? The second was related to the reconciliation point. We know that reconciliation requires working from all levels and often simultaneously. And it strikes me that Ethiopia is in a really sensitive moment, that as talks may start, as Bethel was saying, it is a moment to feel threatened because they are excluded, or because they've been with their respective communities and looking at the threats to them, or it can be a moment to come together to make the strategic case for peace, or at least the strategic case for ending violence, and then articulating what does that need to look like. And in that sense, I think there's a challenge to figure out how to continue to center the conversation on groups that have been excluded, and ensure that that's not done at the exclusion of connections across groups where there is common purpose. And I guess I just leave with a question. I think I agree with recommendations that have been made by other panelists. I think our colleagues in the US government would say how do we connect better with movements and youth groups? What is very tactically, what does that look like? I spend a lot of my time working on Sudan, and the same act comes, and then sometimes the US gets excited and sends people to go and sit with the resistance committees, and then the resistance committees get accused of being a tool of the United States. And so it's, I think, getting your expertise and insight, not just of what needs to happen, but how to get there is incredibly important. Because sometimes when the intent is right, we end up doing harm.
Use this to avoid the feedback issue. Yes, to quickly build up on a couple of Susan's points. One thing I think the United States can do is figure out this special envoy role, which was referenced in the previous question. Yeah, this is our third special envoy. The previous two clearly did not get along with the Africa Bureau and State Department. That's generally considered to be recently work. Mike Hammer, who is the new special envoy, his roles and responsibilities will be very clearly by the U.S. State Department, to whom he reports. Needs to be very clearly defined. And I worry that that he is going to struggle to be effective because of his being. So he had a very difficult task in front of him. He's a great guy and cares deeply and works hard. And so if anybody's doing it, it's him, but he's also somewhat of a prisoner of history, recent history, special envoy. As a general observation on State Department. I wish it would be more expeditionary than it is. This is probably my Peace Corps volunteer bias coming out here, but you know, Peace Corps volunteers are famously sort of posted out in the hinterlands and in rural areas. And I served in Zambia, and it was a running joke that the only place we'd ever encounter a State Department officer was at a nice restaurant in the capital city of Lusaka. That's not fair, obviously. There's plenty of State Department colleagues who try to get out there, but they're also heavily constrained by State Department policy. So I think that policy needs to change, where it does allow State Department officers more flexibility to get out into these areas where they can encounter youth groups and others who don't have access to the centers of power, which is usually the capital in these countries. And I would just wholeheartedly endorse Susan's point and question about how does the U.S. make contact with these groups without sullying them in some way, and without compromising them, and also without violating strictures that the central government has placed sometimes. Sometimes it's the State Department that actually have to defy the central government to do something, and that's a very difficult thing to do. So I would say endorse that question and highlight that dilemma as well.
Great, thank you. Faisal, did I see you raise your hand a moment ago?
Yeah, just would like to add one thing. I think in blunt language, the US policy has been failing in Ethiopia, and we can tell that from the results that we have today. Kenya station used to be US attraction to Ethiopia. She lost that. Now Kenya station is utilized by Russia. The current policy that we see and the current results that we see in the ground indicates that US policy has not really delivered the results that we all wished. The conflicts in Tigray and Oromia did not take place where the US did not stand by, or even where the US ambassador didn't accept the plea by Abiy to say, I finished this in 5 days. All those are symptoms and indications that we have failed. As to the division within the State Department, yes, I think it reminds me of the 1977 division between the two camps, Cyrus Van and Andrew Yang on the one side, and Brzezinski on the other side. Brzezinski saying we need serious engagement wherever the Soviet comes in, whereas people like Andrew Yang and Cyrus Van tried to appease the Derg. The same thing is happening today in the State Department, although I cannot tell personalities as to who is where, but definitely there are groups inside that say we have to die with Abiy no matter what, because he's the leader. And there are others who have seen the reality on the ground, as everybody said, that's shifting from the position which the United States government is. I think data collection is important. That data collection should go beyond the center. I think it should go to the peripheries. We need to understand how the Oromo peasant, the Somali pastoralist, the Tigray farmer is feeling about the current Ethiopian government, and then we can build a policy on that. But if we just do what the IMF does, which is to collect data from the Ethiopian Statistical Office, we will never understand what the people want from the state. And I think that's where we have failed. We collected data from narrow confines of the elite and the center. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Faisal. So we are, I think, 10 minutes over time. So I think we need to wrap in a moment. So let me give you 2 final questions, and then we'll close, and maybe we'll do their final comments. Folks should feel free to make those. Panelists should feel free to make those. So one final for Susan and Josh, and that is really straightforward question. To what extent does concern over Ethiopia's disintegration, I think they mean disintegration as a state, to what extent is that driving or desire to prevent that driving US policy towards Ethiopia, right? So that's one question. And then the second question, final question, is for me, and it picks up on something Josh had discussed earlier, and I think it's important, deserves a little bit more consideration. That's the issue of U.S. leverage in this region, Ethiopia more specifically, right? The Horn of Africa is a geopolitical hot zone, right? We've got China, we've got Russia, we've got middle powers like Turkey, the UAE, et cetera. You know, to what extent does the United States have the capacity to actually shape outcomes in a country like Ethiopia? You know, I think a lot of assumes that the United States can play a decisive role in shaping the trajectory of the country and the prospects for sustainable peace. And I'm just wondering if we could reflect on that particular issue and what is the basis of US leverage at this point in time? All right, so final questions, easy ones as you can tell.
I'll keep it brief, just I'm curious what others have to say about this as well. To the first question about fear that you hear the state disintegrating, yeah, I think that's a big fear for some policy. Because we've discussed a few of the ramifications of that here, but there are many more. Just the potential displacement alone is enough to keep people up at night. So yes, that's obviously would be a fear. I haven't seen that fear diminish with anything that has gone around. What is the basis of U.S. leverage? Ethiopia and the U.S. actually do. You know, from the beginning of this conflict, I've said that I felt like the U.S. was operating somewhat under a false assumption in Ethiopia, and that assumption was that we actually be decisive in this. And this is a pretty unpopular opinion in places, but I've held it consistently. I still hold it that I think there was going to be a war in Ethiopia, even if the United States did everything perfectly right diplomatically. There was a war in Ethiopia because the people who started it wanted to fight a war. They thought that was the best way to achieve their political goals. I don't think the war in Ethiopia is a result of U.S. diplomatic failures. I think that again, this was going to happen. Certainly, the U.S. could have done much better at many different points. When you look at the underlying problems of the Ethiopian state, the contradictions, the ferments, the long history of violence and division in the country, I think we were headed for a very, very serious confrontation, and that's what we got. All sides, as far as I can ascertain, view this conflict as an existential one, meaning they have to win in order to survive. And that means there's not much the U.S. can do to change that. So we can put all the sanctions we want on Abiy, on TPLF, on everybody else, but if they really believe they have to fight to survive, then they will bear the cost of sanctions and whatever else the United States can do to them to continue fighting. And I think that's the situation. Again, this is not any sort of apologia for how the United States has handled this, because I think the United States has done very poorly, not just in Ethiopia, but the whole war and South Africa generally. But I also think it's limited. The U.S.'s ability to stop this war is limited. Fundamentally, it is up to Ethiopians to figure out how to live together in peace and to bring stability to their own country. The United States should play a complementary role. We should be talking to everybody we possibly can. We should be listening. And we should try to come alongside Ethiopians who are committed to peace and have ideas for peace. Persuade anybody to seek peace. People are fighting this war for their very own reasons that are deeply strongly held. Again, that's an unpopular opinion in many venues, but that's how I view this conflict. It's not an excuse for how poorly the U.S. has handled it, but it is a call to all Ethiopians to see what they themselves can do to try to bring some peace to their own country. On that cheerful note, I'll leave it there.
I think in terms of the risk of disintegration of the country, I don't think there's enough attention currently to the economic crisis and the principal aspects of what is taking place and the consequences of the conflict and the violence on the economy. I also worry that this is not just an underestimation of the scale of what's taking place, but as a result, it's an underestimation of what will be required to support if an agreement can be reached, if an inclusive agreement can be reached. The international community has a poor record, I think, not for lack of commitment or desire of mobilizing funding that is politically responsive in a timely manner. And that helps to sustain a political transition forward. So I think that is something for the economists and others in the Euro Studies Association to help to think about, because often we wait to plan and act on that until after people sign the document or reach an agreement. And by that point, we're probably going to be too slow in responding. I actually think the United States has an important role to play. Certainly, Ethiopians will make the peace that have to implement the peace. But it strikes me that this conflict is complicated and driven by factors that come from outside. It's the role of the United States and others in United Nations Security Council and the African Union is to help to provide, to buffer the space so that Ethiopians can have conversations about how they want to move forward. And I think that external influences are fueling and supporting those who are benefiting from continued violence and not sufficiently for those who are seeking to advance peace. So I think that is a role. It's not just the United States role. It needs to be done collectively. And I'll just say as a last note that I'm really struck in conversations that I have with Ethiopians that everyone has been so touched directly by the violence and what is taking place in their country right now. And I think that sense of personal pain is incredibly difficult, and I think it opens an opportunity that with leadership and with conversations like this and conversations that reach across communities, there is a moment where people could be seeking something, knowing how vulnerable they are, and setting up structures that protect not just them, but also that very shared sense of pain that I hear in talking to people all across the country. So I work for a peace organization, and so we don't necessarily have to be optimistic. Always we have to be hopeful. And I think these are the moments that require tremendous courage and leadership. And I hope that I think in our institutions we can help to carry forward not just what can be cold and theoretical policy conversations, but the very human aspects of this that in my mind fundamentally goes back to whether countries like Ethiopia are stable and fulfill the interests of the United States globally. Okay. I wanted to respond to that, but I think I agree very interested with regards to America's participation of America's role, because we don't exist outside of external forces that are outplayed in your currently. So I think it can definitely be decisive, maybe a lesser role than the stuff that it has been historically, because there are so many other external forces at play currently. But I think we can sum that up very well and over time. But I did want to answer question you guys put to us, the how, like I was saying, engage, so, and I think there are a lot of advocacy groups outside in the diaspora, usually because it's harder to operate within the country. I think they can be engaged, and I think they have a lot of depth of information, maybe not as, comprehensive data, a lot of different agencies require, but they do talk to people on a daily basis. They do engage movement leaders from back home. They do advocacy work for prisoners of conscience. They have contact with those who have picked up arms. They have contact with kids hiding. They have contact with youth groups and universities and schools. So I think there's a wealth of information and knowledge that can be gained from the diaspora organizations that are always knocking in different U.S. organizations. And I think also for those who operate within the country, to Dutch point, they need to use the capital and actually start talking to the people within the country, the people in the periphery, because the majority of the population of Ethiopia is in villages. The capital is, I don't know, represents a very small and a very specific political ideologically aligned group. And so I don't think you get the scope of the issues that you get by staying in cities like IDs or even smaller towns. You just have to get out of your comfort zone and start talking to people and actually engaging the country fully and trying to understand what is actually taking place in people's sentiments. And I think that's the top of my head with us. That can be done. I'm sure there's strategists in these organizations that can figure out ways to do. We can't take that stigma of, oh, we're US, because disinformation is huge. Propaganda is huge, especially currently the government system weaponizes it, but that shouldn't be a deterrent. I think ultimately, that may be there, but I think what can be gained out of actually engaging with these groups and talking to these people and engaging with these communities far outweighs the stigma. So I just wanted to suggest that. Thank you.
Okay, just to say on the last thing, I was suggesting about the civil society organizations. But when we look at the establishment of civil society organizations in our country, we have to bear in mind that the country is deeply divided along ethnic lines, and many of we don't see balances among how they are established and who established them and for what purpose they were established. There is a huge imbalance, if you take the civil society organizations that were established by some almost when the crackdown was mainly on them and the government was being brutal against all organizations. So we hardly find these civil society organizations when it comes to the organized groups. We have so many of them in the name of Ethiopia and in very shiny names, but underneath there is only one name. I think when we deal with them, I think we need also to filter how they are established and also who established them and what their part is. I think institutions can be built, and like we said, it's possible to establish institutions that take care of the various mental groups, take care of the groups to accommodate their justice. So I think that the willingness now at policy level is so important. It's so important, and there are ways that
Michael, if I add, Yeah, I think the U.S. has limitations. Of course, I agree, but it has two factors that neither the Soviet nor the Chinese have. Number one, U.S. Help and aid in terms of famine relief and development dollars is unparalleled, unmatched. And Ethiopians and the Horn of Africa in general will always be thankful to that. And that's a huge leverage. How we use is a different thing, but that's one thing that no one has. The second factor that the US has that Russia, China don't have is also the diaspora, which are part of the American fabric. And that's a huge source in terms of the right information and also having both countries. I think we need to recognize that whatever Russia does is a destruction towards the Ethiopian state and the whole. Whatever America can do is more positive in terms of the aid. We just need to know how we can capitalize. Having said that, I think Ethiopia is experiencing many wars. The Tigray war is the biggest, the Oromo war is now the largest. But there are many wars also. The Afar-Somali war is another one, the Afar-Tigray. So I think we need to expand the scope, sustain and support the Tigray and Ethiopian federal government talks that started, try to open another quick but very needed channel between the Oromo Gurubis, inclusive Oromo Gurubis and the federal government. If they cannot be part of the one that's supposed to start in Kenya, start a parallel one. Later on, we can join all that. I would say is, I think the U.S. State Department and the embassy needs to show a sort of even-handed, not only to stay in Addis and talk to those elites, but go to Jigjiga, to Adama, to Walega, to other areas so that they can also have conversations with people who are outside the center and get the real ideas. And thank you very much.
Great, thank you. So I think we've reached the end of our time together. I just do want to ask participants if there's anything sort of final word that they want to offer. If there's anything else that folks want to put on the table, going once, going twice, 3 times. Okay, great. Great, so fantastic. So I want to thank Fatuma, Bekele, Faisal, Susan, and Josh for I think what was a really productive exchange of views. We covered a lot of ground, could have dug in to a few particular issues a bit more, but we're of course limited on time. And I wish everyone a good rest of their Saturday.
Great, thank you very much, Michael. You did a fantastic job moderating from there. So really appreciate this very enlightening conversation that we had. We need to go on much more conversation about this, how to do advocacy, what data will provide the system making this kind of decision. So I think everyone's doing Josh, really thank you so much for coming. This lunch ready. We go out for lunch briefly and have coffee and that, and then we'll be back for the next session. Thank you so much.
Oh, no, that's okay. No. It's fine. I know you're busy. No, not at all. It's good to see you. Love to be in touch with you. All things. Yeah.
Yes.